The dim-lit parking garage was a cavern of shadows, its concrete walls amplifying the staccato rhythm of Officer Grant's hurried footsteps. The air hung heavy with the scent of gasoline and dampness, a fitting backdrop to the tension brewing within him. His radio crackled to life, spitting static as he barked into it, his voice slicing through the stillness with a commanding edge. "I've got him. Suspect matches the description perfectly." His hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching with restless anticipation, as his gaze zeroed in on a tall black man stepping out of a sleek sedan. The man clutched a leather briefcase, his navy blue suit impeccably tailored, but to Grant, those details were irrelevant. In his mind, the profile clicked into place: black, male, tall, early 40s. Near the site of recent thefts, that was all the justification he needed. "Hold it right there." Grant's shout reverberated off the walls, sharp and unyielding, leaving no space for discussion. The man, Marcus Avery, turned slowly, his movements deliberate, almost graceful. His brows furrowed slightly, a faint ripple of confusion crossing his face, but his composure remained a fortress, solid, unshaken. "What's the meaning of this?" Marcus's voice was steady, laced with a quiet disbelief that hinted at the storm of thoughts swirling beneath his calm exterior. He stood there, a pillar of dignity amidst the chaos Grant was about to unleash. "Hands where I can see them," Grant snapped, closing the distance between them with purposeful strides. His boots thudded against the concrete as he seized Marcus's arm, his grip tight and unyielding, fingers digging in with a force that felt personal, almost vindictive. "You're coming with me." Marcus didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he planted his feet firmly, meeting Grant's glare with eyes that burned with a quiet intensity. "Officer," he said, his tone measured but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "I don't know who you think I am, but I assure you, you're making a grave mistake." Grant's lips curled into a smirk, a flash of arrogance lighting his features. "Yeah, we'll let the court sort that out." He tightened his hold, yanking Marcus toward the squad car parked a few spaces away, its lights casting an eerie glow across the garage. Marcus's voice cut through the tension again, still controlled but now edged with a flicker of frustration. "On what basis are you detaining me?" he pressed, his words sharp, probing for the cracks in Grant's flimsy reasoning. "You match the description of a suspect in a string of thefts downtown," Grant replied curtly, his tone clipped as if the question itself was an insult. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, forcing Grant to halt mid-step. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken defiance. "A description of what, exactly?" Marcus's voice sharpened, slicing through the stale garage air like a blade. "A black man in a suit. That's your entire case." His words hung there, heavy with accusation, daring Grant to confront the absurdity of his logic. Grant's smirk hardened into a glare, his jaw clenching as he leaned closer. "You don't get to question me. Now keep moving." Marcus exhaled slowly, a deliberate breath to steady the anger simmering beneath his surface. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice low and resonant, each syllable dripping with a promise that unsettled the air. Grant let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, the sound grating against the silence. "Big words for someone in cuffs," he sneered, motioning to his partner, Officer Daniels, who lingered nearby. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his posture betraying a flicker of doubt. His eyes darted between Grant and Marcus, catching the unwavering resolve in Marcus's gaze. It was a subtle crack in the wall of authority they'd built, and Marcus noticed it instantly, filing it away like a chess player noting an opponent's weakness. "I don't need big words, officer," Marcus replied, his voice taking on a steely edge. "Facts will do just fine." Grant ignored him, his focus narrowing as he dragged Marcus toward the exit, his grip unrelenting. Marcus walked with a steady stride, his head held high despite the humiliation of the moment. Inside, his mind raced, a torrent of thoughts crashing against one another. This wasn't about evidence or justicite was prejudice, raw and unfiltered. Cloaked in the authority of a badge, the realization burned in his chest, fueling a quiet fury he kept tightly reined. As they reached the squad car, Grant flung the door open with a mocking flourish. "Mind your head," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Marcus slid into the back seat without a word, adjusting his tie with precise deliberate movements that spoke of unshakable dignity. He looked up at Grant through the open door, his voice calm but piercing. "You think this is over?" "Oh, it's just starting," Grant shot back, slamming the door shut with a force that rattled the frame. The car pulled out of the garage, tires screeching faintly against the concrete, and a heavy silence settled inside, broken only by the intermittent crackle of the police radio. Marcus sat still, his mind a whirlwind of strategy. He wasn't just a man wrongfully detained who was a federal prosecutor, a master of the legal battlefield, and he was already plotting his counterstrike. Every word, every action from Grant was another brick in the case he'd built against him. Grant, meanwhile, drove with a swaggering confidence that teetered on the edge of arrogance. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening as he replayed the encounter in his mind. He'd done his job, nabbed the suspect case closed, yet something gnawed at him, a splitter of unease he couldn't shake. It wasn't fear in Marcus's eyes, it was certainty, a quiet assurance that rattled Grant more than he'd admit. "You don't look nervous," he said, breaking the silence, his voice tinged with a challenge. Marcus turned his gaze to the rearview mirror, locking eyes with Grant. "Why should I be? I have nothing to hide." His words were a calm rebuke, a mirror held up to Grant's bravado. Grant scoffed, his grip tightening on the wheel. "We'll see about that." The car rolled into the courthouse parking lot, gravel crunching under the tires as Grant stepped out and yanked the back door open. "Let's go," he barked, grabbing Marcus's arm once more. Marcus emerged from the car with the same composed grace he'd maintained throughout, adjusting his suit jacket as if stepping into a boardroom rather than a courtroom. As Grant pulled him forward, Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice a low, firm whisper. "You've already lost." Grant's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek, but he said nothing, dragging Marcus toward the courthouse entrance. Whispers rippled through the gathering onlookers, some curious, some judgmental. Caught another one. "Huh," a bystander muttered, smirking. Grant's lips twitched upward, taking it as praise, but Marcus caught the remark, storing it as yet another thread in the tapestry of bias he'd unravel. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with a harsh fluorescence that cast stark shadows across the tiled floor. Grant strode forward, shoulders squared, his confidence unshaken as they approached the courtroom doors. Marcus, by contrast, moved with a quiet strength, his briefcase still in hand, his posture a silent declaration of resilience. He was no ordinary detainee, and the weight of that truth was about to crash down on Grant like a tidal wave. The heavy wooden doors swung open with a groan, cutting through the low hum of conversation within. Grant stepped inside, one hand clamped around Marcus's arm, the other brushing his holster as if anticipating resistance. Marcus walked with a measured pace, his chin high, each step radiating control despite the indignity of his situation. The room erupted in murmurs as they entered. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, some with curiosity, others with snap judgments. "He looks like he's got money, but you never know with these types," a voice whispered. Another chimed in. "Grant's got another one and must have caught him red-handed." The words stung the air, but Marcus didn't flinch, refusing to let the crowd's prejudice sway him. "Sit," Grant ordered, shoving Marcus toward the defendant's table. Marcus complied, setting his briefcase down with care and unbuttoning his suit jacket with a calm precision that defied the chaos around him. At the front, Judge Harper entered, his robe billowing as he climbed to his bench. His weathered face carried the lines of countless cases, and his sharp eyes swept the room before he cleared his throat. The murmurs died instantly. "Officer," Harper began, his voice steady but resonant with authority, "you may present the charges." Grant stepped forward, chest puffed out, his voice brimming with certainty. "Your Honor, the defendant, Marcus Avery, matches the description provided by multiple witnesses regarding a series of thefts downtown. Black male, approximately 40 years old." His words hung in the air, a flimsy scaffold of accusation that Marcus was poised to dismantle. The room held its breath, sensing the storm about to break. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a reckoning. Grant's abuse of power, driven by unchecked prejudice, had collided with an undeniable truth. Marcus was a force of justice himself, a federal prosecutor who'd turned this injustice into a lesson etched in stone. The consequences of wielding authority without accountability were about to unfold. A stark reminder that truth, when ignored, has a way of roaring back with unrelenting force. On a crisp evening, the air thick with the tension of an unfolding drama, a man clad in a dark jacket found himself ensnared by the hands of law enforcement, just steps from where a series of crimes had rattled the community. Officer Grant, a seasoned figure whose broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of his badge, spoke with a tone so assured it felt as though the ink had already dried on the verdict. His words were clipped, rehearsed, as if he'd recited them 100 times in his mind before letting them spill into the courtroom. He stood tall, his chest puffed slightly, exuding a confidence that suggested the case was a formality, a puzzle already solved. Across the room, Marcus Avery sat in silence, his presence understated yet magnetic. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, betraying no hint of unease. For a fleeting moment, a smirk danced across his lip, sharp, knowing, almost daring before it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His face settled back into a mask of calm neutrality. But beneath that composed exterior churned a mind alight with calculation. Every breath he took seemed deliberate, every subtle shift of his body a prelude to something greater. The courtroom, with its polished wooden benches and hushed spectators, held its breath as Judge Harper, a man whose stern features and silver-streaked hair spoke of decades wielding justice, turned his piercing gaze toward Marcus. "Mr. Avery," the judge intoned, his voice a low rumble that cut through the stillness. "Do you have anything to say in response to these charges?" The room froze, a collective inhale rippling through the gallery as all eyes locked onto Marcus. He leaned forward ever so slightly, the motion slow and intentional, as though savoring the weight of the moment. With a steady hand, he placed his sleek leather briefcase on the table, the soft click of its latches reverberating like a drum roll in the silence. He withdrew a crisp document folder, adjusted his tie with a practiced flick, and rose to his feet. His posture was impeccable, shoulders squared, exuding an authority that seemed to fill the space around him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice deep and resonant, each syllable landing with the precision of a seasoned orator. "My name is Marcus Avery. I am a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice." The revelation struck the room like a bolt of lightning, electrifying the air. A gasp swelled from the audience, barely contained, as whispers erupted in the back rows. Even Judge Harper, whose steely demeanor rarely wavered, blinked in quiet astonishment, his furrowed brow softening for just a heartbeat before regaining its hard edge. Officer Grant's unshakable confidence faltered. His lips twitched into a fleeting grimace before he masked it with a dismissive scoff. "Your Honor," Grant interjected, his voice tight with irritation, "I fail to see how his profession changes anything here." Marcus pivoted to face Grant, his dark eyes narrowing into a gaze so sharp it could have sliced through steel. "It's relevant," he replied, his tone steady but laced with an undercurrent of steel, "because it exposes the sheer recklessness of your actions. I was detained without a shred of probable cause, pinned down by nothing more than a vague description that could fit half the men walking these streets." The gallery buzzed louder now, the murmur of voices swelling as the gravity of Marcus's words settled over them like a storm cloud. Grant shifted his weight, discomfort etched into the lines of his face. His hand brushed against the holster at his hip, a nervous tick, a reflex born of years on the beaten. Marcus's keen eyes didn't miss it. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, turning back to the judge with a renewed intensity, "this isn't just a simple mix-up. This is a glaring, undeniable example of bias twisting judgment into something dangerous." Officer Grant didn't pause to ask who I was. He didn't request my identification or inquire about my purpose. He leapt to a conclusion, one steeped not in evidence but in prejudice. Judge Harper leaned back in his high-backed chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully beneath his chin, his expression a fortress of inscrutability. The tension in the room thickened, pressing against the walls as every soul present hung on the exchange. "Officer Grant," the judge said at last, his voice slicing through the charged atmosphere like a blade. "How do you answer these allegations?" Grant straightened, though the flicker of doubt in his eyes betrayed the dimming of his earlier bravado. "Your Honor," he began, his words measured but tinged with a defensive edge. "The description came straight from multiple witnesses, A tall black male, early 40s, wearing a dark jacket, Mr. Avery matched it perfectly, and he was spotted near the crime scene. My intent wasn't to single anyone out unfairly, it was to follow the leads I had. Marcus arched an eyebrow, his expression a potent mix of disbelief and resolve. Follow leads, or rush to judgment, he countered, stepping forward with a grace that belied the fire in his voice. Did you ask those witnesses for anything specific? Scars, clothing details, anything unique? Did you check my ID? Did you even ask where I was headed before deciding I was your man? Grant's mouth opened, but the words caught in his throat, his silence roaring louder than any defense he might have mustered. Marcus turned back to the judge, his voice rising just enough to ensure the gallery caught every word. This, he said, gesturing toward Grant with a sweep of his hand, is the problem. Vague descriptions breed vague policing, and who pays the price? People like me. Black men stopped, questioned, and detained without reason over and over again. The gallery erupted into a low rumble of voices, indignation and agreement threading through the crowd. Judge Harper raised a hand, his authority reasserting itself with quiet force. Enough, he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. His gaze shifted between Marcus and Grant, unreadable yet piercing. Mr. Avery, you'll have your chance to expand on this. For now, Officer Grant, unless you have more evidence to present, we'll move forward with what's been said. Grant swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he nodded stiffly. Understood, Your Honor, he muttered, his voice subdued. Marcus returned to his seat, each step deliberate, his presence still commanding the room even in retreat. Grant lingered awkwardly near the bench, casting a glance toward his partner, a weary figure slouched in the back, his uniform slightly rumpled, his eyes fixed on the floor. The partner's discomfort was palpable. He shifted in his seat, avoiding Grant's searching look as though the weight of the moment pressed too heavily on his shoulders. Judge Harper adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his tone grave as he addressed the room. This courtroom stands for justice, not assumption. What we've heard today will shape our understanding of this arrest and the conduct of those entrusted with the law. We proceed with care. The gavel fell, its sharp crack signaling a brief recess, and Marcus leaned back in his chair. His face remained a portrait of calm, but his mind buzzed with razor-sharp focus, replaying every word, every glance, every falter. The courtroom resumed minutes later, the air still heavy with unresolved tension. Judge Harper leaned forward, his steady gaze settling on Grant. Officer, you've leveled serious charges against Mr. Avery. Explain the evidence behind this arrest. Grant cleared his throat, the sound rough and uncertain as he gathered his thoughts. Your Honor, he said, his voice cautious but edged with a stubborn resolve. The arrest hinged on witness accounts. The suspect was described as a tall black male, around 40, in a dark jacket. Mr. Avery fit that profile to the letter and was seen leaving an area close to where the thefts occurred. Marcus's expression didn't waver, though his eyes tightened slightly at the corners. He adjusted his tie with a subtle flick, leaned forward, and signaled his intent to respond. Your Honor, if I may, he said, pausing for Harper's nod before pressing on. Officer Grant, did you confirm my identity before you detained me? Did you ask where I'd been or where I was going? Grant hesitated, his discomfort blooming under Marcus's unrelenting scrutiny. No, he admitted after a beat, the word falling heavy between them. I didn't. Marcus tilted his head, his voice hardening like tempered steel. Did you ask for my ID, any documentation to back up your hunch? Grant squared his shoulders, clinging to the remnants of his authority. I didn't see the need at the time. I was acting on my training and instincts. Instincts, Marcus repeated, the word dripping with a quiet fury that cracked his calm facade. Officer, your instincts aren't the law. They're not a stand-in for evidence or due process. Grant's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening as he bristled. I acted on the description from witnesses, he shot back, his voice rising with a hint of desperation. It was my job to chase leads. Marcus rose again, his presence swelling to fill the courtroom. Chase leads, or leap to conclusions rooted in biases you won't name, he challenged, his tone a velvet-trapped blade. Tell me this, Officer Grant, if I'd been a white man in this same suit, Carrying this same briefcase, would you have hauled me in without a second thought? The question hung like a guillotine, its edge gleaming in the silence that followed. The gallery stirred, the weight of Marcus's words sinking deep. Grant's lips parted, but no answer could make his silence a confession in itself. Marcus pressed forward, his voice steady but brimming with restrained passion. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't check my credentials. You didn't stop to question your own assumptions. Instead, you chose to detain me, to humiliate me in public, all based on a description so broad it could have snared 100 men in this city alone. Judge Harper tapped his gavel lightly, reining in the growing unrest as the gallery's murmurs swelled. Officer Grant, the judge said, his voice firm and unyielding. Can you offer anything more specific from those descriptions setting to set Mr. Avery apart? Grant fumbled with his notepad, flipping pages with trembling fingers as if salvation might lie buried in the scrawl. Tall black male, dark jacket, he repeated, his voice softer now, almost lost. The courtroom held its breath, the lesson unfolding before them stark and undeniable. Justice demands more than assumption, and the abuse of power leaves scars that linger far beyond the moment. In the dimly lit courtroom, where the air hung heavy with the scent of polished wood and unspoken truths, Marcus stood firm, his broad shoulders squared against the rising tide of tension. His dark eyes flickered with a quiet fury as he shook his head, the motion deliberate, slicing through the murmur of voices like a blade through silk. Uncertain, that's what the witnesses reported, he said, his voice sharp and resonant, cutting through the unease that pulsed through the room. He pivoted slowly, turning to face the gallery sea of onlookers, some curious, others skeptical, his expression a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. That's not a description, it's a lazy stereotype dressed up as fact, he declared, his words dripping with disdain. This is what happens when those sworn to uphold justice lean on flimsy generalizations, instead of doing the hard work of investigation. Innocent people who contribute, who build, who live productive live a sorry hunted down, branded as criminals and stripped of their humanity. Across the room, Officer Grant shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing the polished floor as he stepped forward, his face flushed with frustration, his jaw tight as though clenching back a storm of words. You're twisting this, he snapped, his voice thick with defensiveness, cracking slightly under the weight of Marcus's accusation. I wasn't targeting you. I was doing my job following protocol, acting on what I was told. His hands balled into fists at his sides, betraying the turmoil bubbling beneath his outward resolve. He wanted to believe he was in the right, that his actions were justified. But doubt gnawed at the edges of his certainty, unspoken yet palpable. Marcus's gaze locked onto Grant's, unyielding, a fire smoldering in his eyes that refused to be extinguished. Your job, he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Your job is to protect and serve, not to profile and assume. What you did wasn't just careless, it was a reckless abuse of power, a danger to everyone it touches. You didn't see me, officer. You didn't see a man standing before you, with a life, a story, a purpose. You saw a caricature, a shadow shaped by your own warped lens of prejudice. The words hung in the air, heavy and accusing, as the room fell into a suffocating silence. The gallery held its breath, the weight of Marcus's truth pressing down on every soul present. Judge Harper, perched high on his bench, leaned back in his chair, his weathered fingers steepled beneath his chin. His sharp, discerning eyes darted between the two men, taking in every nuance. A tremble in Grant's stance, the steel in Marcus's voice. He was a man accustomed to sifting through chaos to find clarity, and now he observed this clash with the patience of someone who had seen justice bend and break too many times. Mr. Avery, he said at last, his voice steady and measured, cutting through the stillness like a gavel's echo. While your argument carries weight and passion, we are here to address the specifics of this incident. Let's keep our focus on the matter at hand. Marcus turned to face the judge, his posture softening just enough to show respect, though the edge in his tone remained razor-sharp. Your Honor, I hear you, and I'll comply, he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. But this case doesn't exist in isolation. Officer Grant's actions weren't some random misstep or a thread. in a much larger tapestry of failure. A system that chews up and spits out people like me every single day. It's not just about what happened to me. It's about the countless others who suffer the same fate. Caught in a cycle of injustice fueled by unchecked power, Judge Harper nodded, his expression a mask of neutrality, though a flicker of something recognition perhaps passed through his eyes. Duly noted, he replied, his tone even. Officer Grant, do you have any further evidence to present? Grant hesitated, his earlier bravado crumbling like dry earth underfoot. He shifted his weight from one leg to the other, his fingers twitching as if searching for something to hold onto. The room seemed to close in around him, the silence amplifying his unease. No, Your Honor, he admitted at last, his voice barely rising above a whisper, a stark contrast to the confidence he'd carried into the courtroom. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his own words or lack thereof pressing down on him. Marcus seized the moment, stepping forward again, his presence commanding the space. His gaze swept across the room, taking in not just the judge but the gallery wide-eyed spectators, the fidgeting court clerks, the stony-faced bailiff in the corner. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice rising with a quiet power that demanded attention. This is about a system that hands officers a license to act on gut feelings instead of cold, hard facts. A system that singles out black men like me, tearing apart families, shattering lives, and offering no accountability when the damage is done. The gallery stirred, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. Some shifted in their seats, avoiding his gaze. Others leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Grant's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling beneath the surface, though for once, he held his tongue. The cracks in his certainty were visible now as arms hung limp at his sides, his eyes darting to the floor as if searching for an escape. He'd walked into this room believing he was the hero of his own story, but Marcus's words had flipped the script, leaving him exposed and unsteady. Judge Harper let out a slow, deliberate sigh, his gavel tapping lightly against the bench's soft sound that carried the weight of inevitability. Let us proceed, he said, his tone heavy with the promise of a reckoning still to come. Mr. Avery, you'll have your chance to lay out your full case. Officer Grant, be ready to answer these charges with whatever evidence you can muster or explain why you can't. The judge's words settled over the room like a storm cloud, thick with tension and unresolved questions. As Marcus returned to his seat, his movements were calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the fire he'd just unleashed. He sat with the poise of a man who knew he'd struck a chord, not just in this courtroom, but in the hearts of those watching. Grant, still standing, looked like a man unmoretta's confidence rattled, though a flicker of stubborn resolve lingered in his clenched fists. The bailiff, a weary man with a perpetually sour expression, shifted his weight and muttered something under his breath, his disdain for the proceedings barely concealed. In the gallery, a young woman with braided hair clutched a notepad, her brow furrowed as she scribbled furiously, while an older man in a worn jacket nodded slowly, whispering to his neighbor, "He's right, you know, seen it too many times." The courtroom settled into a heavy hush as Marcus rose once more, his presence filling the space like a gathering storm. He took a long, deliberate breath, his eyes scanning the room past the judge, past Grant, past the rows of onlookers who now hung on his every move. The air crackled with anticipation, the faint hum of the overhead lights the only sound daring to break the silence. When he spoke, his voice carried a gravitas that rooted everyone in place. "Your Honor," he began, turning to Judge Harper with a nod, "what we're dealing with here isn't just a mix-up or a case of mistaken identity. This is a symptom of a rot that's been festering in law enforcement for far too long, a sickness that thrives on apathy and unchecked authority." Grant, standing off to the side, crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his posture rigid as if bracing for a blow. He didn't interrupt, but his eyes burned with a mix of defiance and discomfort, the words sinking into him like thorns he couldn't pull free. Marcus's voice wasn't just aimed at him, it was a reckoning for something bigger, something that loomed over them all. Marcus began to pace, his steps slow and purposeful, each one echoing faintly against the hardwood floor. "This officer," he said, gesturing toward Grant without looking at him, Acted on a description so vague it could have fit half the men in this city. Tall black male. Dark clothing fits it. That's all it took for him to decide I was guilty. No questions, no investigation, no pause to consider the life he was about to upend. Just a snap judgment, a dangerous one, rooted in bias he didn't even bother to question. He stopped, letting the silence stretch, the weight of his accusation settling over the room like a fog. And let's not kid ourselves, this isn't some rare fluke. How many black men have been stopped, searched, harassed, or worse, all because they fit the description? It's a phrase we've heard so often it's lost its meaning. But I'll tell you what it really is. It's prejudice wearing the mask of procedure. It's turning law-abiding citizens into suspects based on nothing more than the shade of their skin. The gallery buzzed softly, a current of unease threading through the crowd. A middle-aged woman in a bright red coat shifted in her seat, her lips pursed as if wrestling with her own thoughts. Beside her, a teenage boy with a faded backpack leaned forward, his wide eyes locked on Marcus, drinking in every word. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face the room head-on, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. "Let me paint you a picture," he said, his tone softening slightly, inviting them into his world. "When I was in law school, I drove an old Mercedes, not some shiny status symbol. Just a car I'd worked my bones off to afford, something I took pride in. One night, I'm driving home, minding my own business, when two officers pull me over. No speeding ticket, no busted taillight, just me. A black man behind the wheel of a car they decided I had no business driving." A murmur rippled through the audience, a mix of surprise and recognition. Marcus's voice grew quieter, but the pain behind it swelled, filling the room. I asked them why calmly, politely, because I knew better than to let my anger show. And you know what they said? They told me I looked out of place. Not out of place on the road. Not out of place in traffic, out of place in their tiny, brittle idea of who I was allowed to be. That moment didn't just sting, it carved something out of me. It was a reminder that no matter how hard I worked, how much I achieved, to some people I'd never be more than a suspect. He glanced at Grant, his eyes cutting like glass. And that's the same kind of lazy, poisonous assumption that landed us here today. Grant bristled, his arms dropping as he stepped forward. "Your Honor," he interjected, his voice taut with frustration. "With all due respect, this isn't about me. I followed procedure. I acted on witness statements, critical ones. I didn't make this personal." His words were firm, but there was a tremor beneath them, a crack in the armor he'd worn so confidently before. Marcus wheeled on him, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Procedure? Is it procedure to stop a man without a single question? To cuff him and haul him in because his skin matches some vague sketch in your head? Tell me, officer, granted you stopped for even a heartbeat to think about the life you were derailing? Or did you just see me and decide I was guilty? No evidence required." Grant opened his mouth, his breath catching as if to argue, but Marcus pressed on, his voice swelling with righteous fury. "You didn't just detain me that day. You branded me a criminal not because of what I did, but because of who I am. That's not negligence. That's a betrayal of everything justice is supposed to stand for." Judge Harper tapped his gavel, a soft but firm sound that pulled the room back from the brink. "Mr. Avery," he said, his voice calm but authoritative, "please tether your argument to the specifics of this case. We're here to unpack Officer Grant's actions, not to try the entire system." Marcus nodded, a flicker of deference in his eyes, though his resolve didn't waver. "Your Honor, I'll keep it tight," he said, "but the specifics are crystal clear. Officer Grant acted on bias masquerading as instinct, on stereotypes posing as evidence. I'm lucky you've got a voice, a platform to fight back. But what about the others? How many kids, fathers, brothers are locked up right now, guilty of nothing but crossing paths with the wrong officer at the wrong time, wearing the wrong skin?" The room grew still, the gravity of his words sinking deep. Even the bailiff, who'd spent the morning scowling at the clock, straightened slightly, his gruff exterior softening as he scratched his chin. In the back, a man in a threadbare coat muttered, "He's got a point," his voice low but carrying. A woman nearby, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose, nodded silently, her fingers tightening around a crumpled tissue. Marcus's words weren't just an argument, they were a mirror, forcing everyone to confront the cracks in a system they'd long taken for granted. As the proceedings rolled on, Marcus didn't just defend himself, peeled back the layers of a justice system riddled with flaws, exposing the raw truth beneath. Every word he spoke was a lesson in accountability, a warning of what happens when power runs wild without consequence. Grant stood there, his earlier swagger reduced to a flicker, wrestling with the realization that his actions, however routine they'd felt, had rippled far beyond that single moment. And in the quiet corners of the gallery, the spectators began to see it too, that justice, when twisted by prejudice, becomes its own kind of crime. The air in the courtroom hung thick with tension, a palpable weight pressing down on every soul present. From his seat among the onlookers, a man leaned forward, his posture rigid with skepticism. His whispered words slithered through the stillness, sharp and cutting, meant only for the ear of the person beside him. "He's just playing the race card." The accusation lingered, venomous and dismissive, a quiet jab at the man standing tall at the center of it, Marcus Avery. Marcus caught the murmur, his ears attuned to the undercurrents rippling through the gallery. His head turned slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes locking onto the sea of faces watching him. The whisperer shrank back slightly, but Marcus's gaze didn't waver when he spoke. His voice was steady, a deep timbre that carried both resolve and restraint. "This isn't about a card," he said, each word measured yet piercing. "And it's certainly not an excuse. This is about accountability, about facing the hard truth that when we let bias twist our choices, we chip away at the very foundation of justice itself." His tone softened as he shifted his attention back to the bench, addressing Judge Harper directly. "Your Honor, I know Officer Grant thought he was doing his duty, but believing you're right doesn't wipe away responsibility. Following procedure doesn't pardon prejudice and instinct. That's no shield for injustice." Judge Harper sat back in his high-backed chair, his weathered hands forming a steeple beneath his chin. The lines on his face deepened as he weighed Marcus's words, his gray eyes narrowing in thought. The gallery fell silent, the rustle of shifting bodies and muted coughs swallowed by the gravity of the moment. Every pair of eyes zeroed in on Marcus not as a man on trial, but as a voice daring to challenge the unseen cracks in a system they'd all taken for granted. His presence filled the room, not with arrogance, but with a quiet, unshakable conviction that demanded to be felt. Across the room, Officer Grant stood stiffly, his broad frame betraying unease. He shifted his weight from one polished boot to the other, the faint squeak of leather against the hardwood floor cutting through the stillness. His jaw clenched, and his hands twitched at his sides as if fighting the urge to defend himself. "I didn't mean to target anyone unfairly," he muttered, the words slipping out almost involuntarily. A fragile plea meant more for his own conscience than the court. But Marcus heard it, and like a hawk spotting movement in the grass, he pounced. "That's the problem, Officer Grant," Marcus said, his voice rising just enough to sharpen its edge. "Bias doesn't knock on the door and announce itself. It doesn't come with a flashing sign or a handbook. It slips into the shadows of phrases like 'just doing my job' or 'following procedure.' But its claws are real, and they tear into lives. The consequences, they're devastating, and they're sitting right here in front of you." He gestured subtly to himself, a man in a tailored suit whose dignity had been stripped away in handcuffs, now reclaimed through every syllable he spoke. Judge Harper exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades on the bench. His fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood, a rhythmic tick as he processed the exchange. "Mr. Avery," he said at last, his voice gravelly yet even, "you've made compelling points about flaws woven into the system, but this court's purpose is to sift through the facts of this specific case. Let's keep our focus there." His tone was firm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, perhaps respect, perhaps unease. Marcus inclined his head, a slight bow of acknowledgement. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied smoothly, his voice steady as ever. "But I hope this moment lingers beyond these walls. We can't untangle a single action from the web it's caught in. If we turn a blind eye to these flaws, we're not just ignoring them, we're feeding them, letting them grow stronger." His words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading through the room. Judge Harper's nod was slow, thoughtful, his gaze drifting between Marcus and Grant as if measuring the distance between their truths. The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy shroud draped over the courtroom. Marcus eased back into his seat, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable yet resolute. His argument lingered in the air, a faint haze that refused to dissipate, stirring unease in even the most hardened skeptics. Eyes turned to Officer Grant, who now stood alone in the spotlight, his once assured posture crumbling under the scrutiny, his lips pressed into a thin, pale line, and his shoulders hunched as if the weight of Marcus's words had settled physically upon him. The confidence that had once defined him, a shield forged in years of patrolling street snow, seemed brittle, cracked by doubt. Officer Grant, Judge Harper's voice sliced through the stillness, calm but insistent. Do you have a response to what Mr. Avery has raised? The question hung there, a challenge wrapped in neutrality. Grant shifted again, his boots scuffing the floor. When he spoke, his voice was tight, strained, as if each word had to be dragged from some reluctant corner of his mind. Your Honor, I've already explained myself. The witnesses gave a description that matched Mr. Avery's height, build, clothing. I acted on that. My job is to respond fast, to keep people safe. I thought I was doing it right. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his eyes boring into Grant. Fast. He echoed, the word dripping with quiet disbelief. You call it fasty, call it reckless. Efficient would have been pausing for one question before you snapped those cuffs on my wrists. Efficient would have been glancing at my ID, asking where I'd been, checking the facts. Instead, you saw a chance to act, and you took it. No hesitation, no thought. That's not duty. Officer, that's a short cue, and it led you straight over the line. Grant's face flushed, a deep crimson creeping up his neck. I wasn't reckless, he snapped, his voice cracking with defensiveness. I was doing my job. The outburst echoed off the walls, raw and unpolished, a glimpse of the frustration simmering beneath his badge, his hands balled into fists, knuckles whitening. You think it's easy out there? Split-second decisions, lives on the line? We don't get to sit back and debate every move, hesitate, and the real bad guys slip through your fingers. Marcus rose to his feet, his movements fluid, deliberate, his voice slicing through Grant's tirade like a honed blade. Your responsibility isn't to catch someone, Officer Grant, it's to catch the right someone. If that means taking an extra breath, asking one more question, then that's what you do. Because the alternative, the assumptions, the rush to judgment, that's what drags innocent people like me to rooms like this, fighting to prove we're not the monsters you decided we were. His words were a quiet storm, fierce yet controlled, leaving no room for retreat. Grant opened his mouth, a retort poised on his tongue, but it faltered. Marcus's tone sharp, unyielding, pinned him in place, stripping away the bravado he'd clung to. Judge Harper leaned forward, his brow creasing as he interjected. Officer, he said, his voice low and measured, the pressures of your work are real, and this court doesn't dismiss them lightly. But they don't excuse cutting corners. Tell me specifically, what steps did you take to confirm Mr. Avery was the man you were after? Before you detained him? Grant hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard to follow the description. He stammered, his earlier certainty unraveling. Multiple witnesses said they saw someone who looked like him near the thefts. I thought he believed it was enough to act. His voice grew smaller, the words stumbling over each other as he struggled to justify the moment that had spiraled into this. Marcus's response was swift, each syllable precise, a surgeon's scalpel cutting through excuses. And did you stop to think how vague that description was? How many men in this citadel, black, wearing a jacket cooled fit that mold? Did it cross your mind, even for a second, that you might be wrong? Grant's eyes dropped, his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet the intensity of Marcus's stare. It wasn't about race, he muttered, the defiance in his tone hollow, a shield too thin to hold. Wasn't it? Marcus shot back, his voice a whip crack that snapped the room to attention. You saw a black man in a suit, and that was enough for you. You didn't see a professional heading home after a long day. You didn't see a husband thinking about dinner with his wife, a father planning to help his kid with homework You saw a suspect. That's not policing, Officer Grant, that's profiling, plain and simple. The gallery erupted, a low rumble of murmurs swelling into a wave of sound. Faces turned to one another, some nodding in quiet agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The tension crackled, electric and uncontainable, until Judge Harper's gavel came down with a sharp crack, silencing the crowd. Enough, he commanded, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. We will maintain order here. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Marcus, who stood tall, unshaken. Your Honor, Marcus said, turning to the bench, his tone leveling out but still resonant. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's felt the sting of this kind of treatment, every life upended, because someone with power didn't pause to question their own lens. Officer Grant might not see it, but he's a thread in a bigger tapestry. A system that lets bias dress up as instinct, that lets prejudice hide behind a badge and a rule book. It's broken, and we can't keep pretending it's not. Grant's shoulders slumped, his once booming voice reduced to a tremor. I didn't intend for this, he said, the admission slipping out like a confession. I was just doing what I thought was right. His eyes flicked up briefly, meeting Marcus's for a fleeting second before dropping again. Burdened by a dawning realization he couldn't shake, Marcus's gaze softened, just a fraction, but his resolve held firm. What you thought was right isn't always what is right, officer. Intent doesn't erase the wreckage left behind. Your choices have consequential ones, heavy ones, and you've got to face them. The words settled over the room like dust after a collapse, quiet but undeniable. Silence reclaimed the space, thick and oppressive. Grant stared at the floor, his fists unclenching, his breath uneven. The certainty that had once armored him lay in shards, replaced by a creeping doubt that gnawed at his core. Judge Harper's voice broke through again, steady and deliberate. Officer Grant, it's evident you believed you were serving the community, but it's just as evident that your approach fell short. This court must weigh both your intent and the fallout of your actions. Do you have anything more to say? Grant drew a shaky breath, his broad frame seeming to shrink. No, Your Honor, he whispered, the words barely audible, a surrender to the moment. Marcus stood still, his presence a quiet force, his fight not just for himself but for a truth too long buried. The courtroom held its breath, the lesson of justicing the cost of power unchecked etched into every inch of the air. The air in the courtroom felt thick, almost suffocating, as Marcus Avery stood tall. His eyes locked onto Judge Harper with a quiet, unshakable resolve. His voice, steady and clear, sliced through the tension like a blade honed by years of conviction. Your Honor, he began, his gaze never wavering. If we allow those entrusted with enforcing the law to escape responsibility for their actions, we're not just bending the rules, we're tearing apart the very foundation of the system. We swear to defend. His words carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls of the room, each syllable a plea for something greater than himself. This isn't about punishing Officer Grant as an individual. It's about ensuring that no one else has to suffer the way I did, humiliated, powerless, caught in the crosshairs of someone else's unchecked authority. Judge Harper, perched behind the bench, tilted his head slightly, his weathered face creasing with thought. The faint lines around his eyes deepened as he absorbed Marcus's argument, his fingers resting lightly on the gavel as if weighing its purpose. Your point is compelling, Mr. Avery, he said, his voice measured but warm, betraying a flicker of respect. Let's move forward. The judge's nod was subtle, but it rippled through the room, shifting the atmosphere as all eyes turned to the man at the center of the storm, Officer Grant. Grant, seated stiffly at the defendant's table, felt the ground beneath him tremble. For the first time, the uniform that had always been his shield felt like a flimsy facade. His hands, once steady, now twitched faintly as he lowered himself back into his chair. Beads of sweat glistened on his brow, catching the dim light of the courtroom. He wasn't just facing Marcus anymore, he was facing the jagged edges of his own conscience. A mirror held up 2 years of decisions he'd never questioned. Every word Marcus spoke widened the fractures in his certainty, forcing him to confront the possibility that he'd been wrong not just today, but for far longer than he cared to admit. His chest tightened as doubt crept in, a quiet intruder dismantling the walls of his self-assurance brick by brick. Marcus rose again, his presence commanding the room like a tide pulling everything toward it. His voice sharpened, cutting through the heavy silence with surgical precision. "This isn't just about me," he declared, his eyes sweeping across the gallery, taking in the faces of strangers, reporters, and a handful of wide-eyed interns scribbling notes. "This is about a system that turns a blind eye to prejudice, letting it fester and grow until it's woven into the fabric of every arrest, every vague suspicion acted upon without a second thought. It's a system that gives people like Officer Grant free rein to wield their power, not because they've earned it, but because the people they target, people like Morelli, have the means to push back." His words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, a challenge to everyone listening. Grant's jaw clenched, the muscles twitching beneath his skin as he fought to hold his tongue. His knuckles whitened against the edge of the table, his breath shallow and uneven. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth in Marcus's words gnawed at him, leaving him stranded in a sea of his own silence. Marcus pressed on, his tone steady as steel. "Let's not kid ourselves into thinking this is some rare mistake. How many innocent lives have been shattered because they matched some half-baked profile? How many more will have to claw their way out of the wreckage if we keep brushing this off as just part of the job?" The courtroom fell silent, a hush so deep it seemed to swallow every rustle of paper, every creak of a chair. All eyes fixed on Marcus as he took a deliberate step forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. He turned to face Grant directly, his gaze piercing through the officer's crumbling defenses. "Officer Grant," he said, his voice low but resonant, "let me ask you something." The question hung there, heavy and expectant, as Grant's eyes flickered with a mix of dread and uncertainty. "If I weren't a federal prosecutor, if I didn't have the education, the connections, the resources to stand here and fight, where would I be right now?" Grant's lips parted, but no sound came. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his earlier swagger replaced by a vulnerability he couldn't mask. The pause stretched on, thick with unspoken truths, and Marcus seized it like a weapon. "You know the answer, don't you?" he pressed, his voice rising with a controlled fury. "I'd be rotting in a holding cell somewhere, drowning in baseless charges. My name would be smeared, my career reduced to ashsel because you couldn't be bothered to dig deeper." Then your first impression. Grant's gaze darted toward Judge Harper, a desperate plea for rescue, but the judge remained stone-faced, offering no lifeline. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more force than a shout. "You didn't mean to ruin me, Officer Grant, I'll give you that much. But good intentions don't erase the damage. Your actions could have ripped my life apart, me family, my future. Everything I've fought for, and for what? A gut feeling. A stereotype you didn't even question." Grant finally found his voice, though it trembled, thin and fragile. "I didn't mean for this," he muttered, his tone laced with defensiveness, but hollowed out by doubt. "I was going off the description. I thought I was doing what was right." Marcus's eyes flashed, and he took another step forward, his shadow falling across Grant's hunched form. "The right thing," he echoed, his voice swelling with incredulity. "The right thing would have been to see me as a human being, not a suspect you could pin your assumptions on. The right thing would have been to ask one question, just one, before you decided I was guilty. But you didn't. You saw a black man in a suit, and that was enough for you. That's not justice, Officer Grant. That's prejudice dressed up in a badge." Grant's face flushed a deep crimson, a storm of emotions warring behind his ice hanger. Shame, defiance. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he might snap back, his fists tightening as if ready to strike. But then his shoulders sagged, the fire in him snuffed out by the weight of Marcus's words. He turned his head away, staring at the floor as if it might swallow him whole, his once rigid posture crumbling under the burden of his own reckoning. Marcus pivoted back to the gallery, his voice ringing out with a clarity that demanded attention. "This isn't just about one officer or one wrongful arrest," he said, his arms gesturing wide to encompass the room. "It's about a system that thrives on these shortcuts, that shrugs off accountability because it's easier than facing the truth. It's about a society that's grown so comfortable with this kind of abuse that we excuse it as routine." He turned to Judge Harper, his tone steady but laced with a quiet fire. "Your Honor, I've spent my life fighting for a system that serves everyone and not just the privileged few, who fit some arbitrary mold of innocence. But how can we call this justice when officers like Grant are free to act on autopilot, wielding their biases like weapons and leaving wreckage in their wake? Grant bristled, his frustration boiling over at last. "You're twisting this," he snapped, his voice cracking as it rose. "I'm not some villain out to get you. I wasn't targeting you because of your race. I was doing my job." Marcus whirled back to face him, his expression hard as granite. "Your job?" He shot back, his words sharp enough to cut. "Your job is to protect the law, not twist it into a tool to hurt innocent people. Your job is to uphold justice, not bury it under lazy assumptions. So tell me, Officer Grant, what part of your job justifies dragging me, man with no evidence against him, into this courtroom?" Grant opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but the words died on his tongue. His arguments, once so solid in his mind, now felt flimsy, crumbling like dry sand. His silence was deafening, a confession he couldn't voice, and Marcus didn't let it pass. "This is the world we're stuck in," he said, his voice slicing through the quiet. "People like me have to fight every single day just to prove we belong, not because of what we've done, but because of who we are. And the worst part, we're supposed to take it in stride, to keep our heads down and let it happen." He turned back to the gallery, his tone softening but still edged with defiance. "But I'm done staying quiet. Not today. Because if we don't call this out, if we don't demand something better, this cycle will grind on, breaking more lives with every turn." Grant's hands balled into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he struggled to hold onto his fraying composure. "You don't get it," he said at last, his voice raw and ragged. "Out there, we've got seconds to decide. We're under pressure to act, to keep the bad guys from slipping away. If we hesitate, we lose everything." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes unyielding. "And if you rush in blind, you shatter innocent lives," he countered. "So which gamble's worse, Officer Grant? Because this act now, think later excuse you're clinging to doesn't just hurt people like might erodes the trust you're supposed to stand for." Grant's shoulders slumped further, the last sparks of resistance fading from his frame. He stared at the floor, his breath uneven, his bravado replaced by a quiet, gnawing doubt that seemed to echo through the room. Judge Harper leaned forward, his calm voice cutting through the charged silence. "Mr. Avery," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "you've made your case clear. But this court has to stick to the facts of this incident. Officer Grant, do you have anything more to say?" Grant lifted his head, his face pale and drawn. "No, Your Honor," he murmured, the words barely audible, a shadow of the man who'd walked in so sure of himself. Marcus tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the judge's authority, but he wasn't finished. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and resolute, "this isn't just about holding Officer Grant to account. It's about holding the whole system to account. Because if we let this slide, if we keep pretending these failures don't matter, we're not just letting down people like me. We're letting down justice itself." The room stilled once more, the gravity of his words settling over everyone like a storm cloud. Marcus had peeled back the layers of Grant's defenses, exposing not just one man's flaws, but the deeper cracks in a system that too often valued power over truth. And in that silence, the lesson rang clear. Unchecked authority carried a price, one that justice demanded be paid. The air in the courtroom thickened with unease as Marcus rose to his feet, his presence commanding every eye in the room. His sharp, unrelenting gaze locked onto Officer Grant, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the faint sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. Marcus's voice sliced through the silence, icy and deliberate, as he began. "Let's strip away the excuses, Officer Grant. You claim you acted based on witness descriptions, so let's hear every single detail. What exactly did those witnesses tell you?" Grant faltered, his once assured demeanor crumbling like dry earth underfoot. His hands fidgeted briefly before he clasped them together, as though clinging to the last threads of his composure. "As I've already said," he started, his voice a shadow of its former strength, trembling slightly at the edges. "The witnesses described the suspect as a tall black male, somewhere in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket. That's what I had to work with." His words hung limply in the air, fragile and unconvincing. Marcus's hand shot up, cutting him off mid-breath. "Stop right there," he said, his tone firm, his eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and restrained fury. "That's it. No unique marks, no specific behaviors that caught their eye, just height, race, age, and the color of a jacket." The question lingered, heavy and accusing, as Marcus took a deliberate step closer, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Grant's mouth opened, then closed, his tongue tripping over itself as he struggled to respond. That's what the witnesses gave me," he finally managed, his voice tight and defensive, his eyes darting toward the floor as if it might offer an escape. Marcus advanced again, his presence looming larger with every step, his voice rising like a tide. "So, what you're telling me is that your witnesses described what could easily be half the black men walking the streets of this city." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room, his piercing stare never wavering from Grant's face. The officer's lips pressed into a thin, taut line, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his chair. "It was credible enough for me to act," Grant muttered, but the fire that once fueled his words had flickered out, leaving only a hollow echo behind. "Credible," Marcus repeated, his voice climbing with incredulity, each syllable sharp enough to cut glass. Credible would have been a name scratched into a witness's memory, a scar etched across a cheek, a tattoo peeking out from a sleevey, something, anything, that pointed to one man and one man alone. What you had wasn't credible, Officer Grant. It was lazy. The gallery stirred, a low rumble of whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through dry leaves, as Marcus's accusation landed with the force of a gavel. But Marcus wasn't finished. His chest rose as he drew a deep breath, his voice swelling with a raw, unfiltered emotion that seemed to shake the very walls. "You didn't see me as a man that day," he said, his eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and defiance. "You didn't see me as a professional with a career, a citizen with a life, a person with rights worth respecting. No, you saw me as a suspect because I fit the vague little checklist in your head. Black, tall, male. That's all it took for you to decide my guilt before I even opened my mouth." Grant's head snapped up, his face flushing red as frustration cracked through his faltering resolve. "That's not true," he shot back, his voice splintering under the strain. "I wasn't out to get you or anyone." Marcus stepped closer still, his expression hardening into something unyielding. "Almost granite-like, isn't it?" he pressed, his voice low and cutting. "Did you even glance at my ID before you slapped those cuffs on me?" Grant froze, his breath catching in his throat, his silence roaring louder than any defense he might have mustered. Marcus didn't relent. "Did you ask me where I'd been, what I was doing, or even pause for a second to see if I matched that flimsy description before you hauled me in here? Like a criminal?" Grant's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding as he shook his head, a faint, reluctant motion. "No," he admitted, his voice so soft it barely carried past the table, a whisper swallowed by the room's growing tension. Marcus turned sharply toward Judge Harper, his posture straight as a blade, his tone steady but edged with righteous indignation. "There you have it, Your Honor. He didn't check my ID. He didn't ask a single question. He acted on nothing but an assumption soaked in bias." Judge Harper's gaze shifted to Grant, his face a mask of calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of scrutiny. "Officer," he said, his voice measured but carrying the weight of authority, "is this true? Did you fail to verify Mr. Avery's identity before detaining him?" Grant's shoulders slumped, as if the question itself pressed down on him, and he nodded, a slow, defeated gesture. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice hollow, stripped of its earlier bravado. The gallery erupted into a chorus of hushed voices, the air crackling with the electric charge of disbelief and outrage. Judge Harper raised his gavel, the sharp rap silencing the room like a thunderclap. Marcus turned back to Grant, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "You didn't arrest me because I was a suspect, Officer Grant. You arrested me because I was a black man who fit the picture of guilt you'd already painted in your mind." Grant's eyes flicked up, a spark of protest flaring briefly. "That's not fair," he said, though his words lacked the heat they once carried. "I wasn't targeting you. I was just following the description." "No," Marcus cut in, his tone cold and final, like the closing of a steel door. "You weren't following the description. You were following your bias, and the fact that you can't even admit it only deepens the problem." Grant's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers twisting together in a knot of quiet defeat. The defiance that once propped him up now reduced to ash. Marcus pivoted toward the gallery, his voice steady and resonant as he addressed the sea of faces watching in rapt silence. "This is what happens when we let stereotypes stand in for real investigation. This is what happens when we brush off bad policing with a shrug and a claim of good intentions. Innocent people get hurt, lives get upended, and the trust we're supposed to have in this system crumbles to nothing." He turned back to Judge Harper, his expression resolute. "Your Honor, this isn't just one man's poor judgment. It's a glaring sign of a system that's failing us all. Officer Grant didn't just make a mistake, it showed us the rot that runs deeper than any one person." Judge Harper leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled before him, his gaze heavy as it settled on Grant. "Officer," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "do you have anything more to say?" Grant shook his head, his voice a faint murmur as he replied, "No, Your Honor." The silence that followed was suffocating, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Marcus had unraveled Grant's defense with surgical precision, leaving the officer exposed, his own words twisting into a noose of his own making. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Harper leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished bench, his sharp eyes darting between Marcus and Grant. After a long, deliberate pause, he spoke, his tone firm yet tempered with a trace of solemnity. "Officer Grant, your actions in this case lay bare some troubling truths, not just about your judgment, but about the very culture and protocols that guide law enforcement. You detained Mr. Avery without a shred of solid cause, leaning on a description so vague it could have fit countless men. By your own admission, you didn't bother to check his identity, ask him a single question, or dig for even a scrap of evidence before you decided he was guilty. This wasn't a minor misstep, it was a catastrophic lapse in reason." The gallery buzzed softly, the weight of the judge's words sinking into the crowd like stones into still water. Harper raised a hand, silencing the murmurs with a single gesture. "That said," he continued, his gaze softening just a fraction as he studied Grant, "I don't believe you acted out of malice. I believe you were shaped by a system that's grown too comfortable with quick assumptions and unspoken biases. But let me be clear, understanding where this came from doesn't erase the responsibility you bear." Grant swallowed hard, his hands clutching the table's edge, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. Harper turned to Marcus, his tone warming with admiration. "Mr. Avery, your poise and clarity in this courtroom have been nothing short of remarkable. You've not only shone a light on the personal wrong done to you, but you've exposed the deeper cracks in a system that lets these wrongs happen far too often. For that, this court owes you its respect." Marcus inclined his head slightly, his face calm but unyielding, a quiet strength radiating from him. The judge's attention snapped back to Grant, his voice sharpening once more. "Officer Grant, this court cannot ignore what's been revealed here today. Your actions and the failures they represent carry consequences. Justice demands accountability, not just for you, but for the system that enabled this. Power, when wielded carelessly, leaves scars on the innocent, and those scars ripple far beyond this room." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the lesson etched into the day's events. Unchecked authority breeds injustice, and the price of that failure is paid by those it was meant to protect. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with tension, and the faint hum of anticipation as Officer Grant sat rigid in his seat, his uniform crisp, but his posture betraying the storm brewing within. His hands, clasped tightly in his lap, twitched faintly as Judge Harper's voice reverberated through the chamber, each word deliberate and unyielding. "You will attend mandatory training on implicit bias and community engagement," Harper declared, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "This isn't a polite request, it's an order." Grant's jaw tightened, his lips parting as if a protest danced on the tip of his tongue, but he swallowed it down, offering only a curt nod. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, a suffocating reminder of how far his actions had strayed from the ideals he'd once sworn to uphold. Harper's gaze, sharp and unwavering, shifted briefly to the gallery, where a ripple of murmurs stirred among the onlookers, some nodding in quiet approval, others exchanging skeptical glances beneath furrowed brows. He pressed on, undeterred. Furthermore, Officer Grant, you will draft a formal written apology to Mr. Avery, acknowledging not only the personal harm you've inflicted upon him, but the broader damage your conduct has done to the integrity of the justice system itself. The judge's voice rose slightly, cutting through the growing hum of the room like a blade honed by years of experience. Grant stared at the polished wood of the table before him, his hazel eyes clouded with a mix of defiance and dawning regret. He could feel the eyes of the room boring into him, each gaze a silent accusation, and the realization gnawed at him. This wasn't just about one mistake, it was about the cascading consequences of wielding power carelessly. But Harper wasn't finished. Leaning forward slightly, his robes rustling faintly, he added, I'm also directing the police department to conduct a comprehensive review of its protocols for detaining suspects based on witness descriptions. If what happened here is standard practice, then the system itself is rotten at its core and demands immediate reform. The gallery erupted into a louder buzz, a chorus of agreement clashing with murmurs of dissent. An older woman in the back, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, nodded solemnly, her weathered hands clutching a worn purse as if anchoring herself to the judge's words. Beside her, a younger man in a faded jacket crossed his arms, his lips curling into a faint sneer. Wasn't convinced change was possible in a machine so entrenched. Harper let the noise swell and fade, his presence commanding silence as he continued. If our procedures are built on a foundation of bias, he said, his voice rising with a quiet fury, they will only deepen the wounds of injustice. And if we, as a society, turn a blind eye to that truth, we've abandoned the very principles we claim to champion: fairness, equality, accountability. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward, forcing everyone in the room to confront their own complicity. Grant shifted uncomfortably, the starched collar of his uniform suddenly feeling like a noose. His mind churned, replaying the moment he'd stopped Marcus Avery on that dimly lit street. Vague witness description, the flicker of instinct that had spiraled into a grave error. He'd always seen himself as a protector, a shield for the community. But now that image cracked under the weight of Harper's judgment. Across the room, Marcus sat poised and unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the judge's bench. His broad shoulders were squared, but beneath his composed exterior simmered a quiet storm of frustration, pain, and a fierce resolve. He'd endured the humiliation of handcuffs biting into his wrists, the cold indifference of a system that saw him as a threat rather than a man, and now he bore the scars of that night not on his skin, but in his soul. Harper turned his attention to Grant, his tone softening but retaining its steel core. Officer Grant, I believe you joined the force with a genuine desire to serve and protect your community. I don't doubt that, but good intentions alone don't absolve you of responsibility. It's your duty to confront the biases that cloud your judgment. If you shy away from that work, you won't just harm the people you vowed to safeguard, you'll erode the very foundation of the system you represent. Grant nodded again, his throat tight as he forced out a low, I understand, Your Honor. His voice trembled faintly, a crack in the armor he'd worn so proudly for years. He wanted to believe he could change, that this moment could reshape him. But the path ahead felt daunting, shadowed by the mistakes he could no longer unmake. The judge's eyes shifted to Marcus, softening further with a trace of empathy. Mr. Avery, I hope this ruling offers you some semblance of closure. This court can't undo the indignity you've suffered, the fear and frustration you've carried, but it can demand accountability and strive to prevent such wrongs from happening again. Marcus rose slowly, his movements deliberate, exuding a quiet dignity that filled the room. Thank you, Your Honor, he said, his voice steady as granite yet laced with an undercurrent of restrained emotion. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to walk through the hell I did. I hope this shakes the system awake, and not just Officer Grant, but every cog in its machinery. His words carried a weight that silenced the room, a plea and a challenge wrapped into one. Harper inclined his head, a subtle gesture of respect, then brought his gavel down with a sharp tap. "This case is adjourned." The room exhaled collectively, a soft murmur rising as people gathered coats and bags, their footsteps shuffling against the worn hardwood floor. Grant lingered in his seat, his broad frame slumping slightly as the reality of his reckoning settled in. His face, flushed with a mix of shame and resolve, betrayed the turmoil within. Had never intended to hurt anyone, yet the harm was undeniable. Hesitantly, he turned toward Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, the words raw and unpolished. "I didn't mean to." Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off with a gesture as firm as it was weary. "This isn't about what you meant, Officer Grant. It's about what you did. Use the learn from it. Not just for you, but for everyone you're supposed to protect." Grant's face burned hotter, and he nodded once more before rising and slipping out of the courtroom, his boots echoing faintly in the emptying space. Marcus remained, his gaze sweeping the now nearly deserted room. The victory felt bittersweet, a single spark in a vast, shadowed struggle. The fight for true change stretched far beyond these walls, a marathon he knew would test his endurance. As he stepped into the corridor, a small swarm of reporters awaited, their microphones and cameras thrusting toward him like eager hands. A young woman with sharp eyes and a notepad pushed forward. "Mr. Avery, how do you feel about the judge's decision today?" Marcus met her gaze, then turned to the camera, his voice calm but resonant, carrying the strength of a man who'd weathered a tempest. "This isn't about my feelings. It's about what this ruling stands for and what it doesn't. Today's a step, but it's a small one. If we're serious about justice, we've got to dig deeper, tear out the roots of a system that's flawed to its bones." The reporters pressed closer, hungry for more. "What flaws do you mean?" a man with a gravelly voice called out. Marcus didn't flinch. "The bias that judges people by their skin instead of their deeds. The laziness that lets vague sketches and half-baked procedures pass for real police work. The arrogance that says good enough is fine when lives hang in the balance." His words crackled with conviction, each one a spark igniting the air. He stepped forward, his presence commanding their full attention. "This wasn't some rare fluke, it's a pattern. Every day, people, especially from communities like mine, get targeted, locked up, or worse, all because of snap judgments from those with power. That's not a mistake, it's a sickness, and until we cure it, we're just patching up symptoms while the disease festers." A third reporter, her tone edged with skepticism, raised a hand. "But Officer Grant said he was just following protocol. Isn't the system the real problem?" Marcus nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "You're right, protocols are broken, but don't let that be an excuse. People build systems, people keep them running, and people can tear them down and build something better." Grant had a choice that night, leaned on bias instead of facts. The system didn't force his hand, it just gave him the room to swing it. The crowd fell silent, captivated by the clarity of his vision, the fire in his resolve. He took a breath, his voice softening, but no less potent. "Accountability's the answer, you. Unflinching accountability for every officer, every judge, every soul who holds power over another's life. Training's a start, but it's not enough. We need oversight that bites, education that sticks, a system that puts truth over shortcuts and people over pride." The reporters scribbled furiously, some nodding as his words sank in. Marcus stepped back, his eyes scanning the faces before him, some hopeful, some wary, all listening. "This isn't about tearing down the police," he added, his tone sharpening with purpose. "It's about lifting them up to what they could be. I don't want officers like Grant to crash and burn. You want them to rise and do right. But right isn't measured in arrests or closed cases. It's measured in justice, serial justice. And that's not served when innocent people are shackled because of who they are or where they're from." He paused, letting the lesson settle, a stark reminder that power unchecked breeds ruin, while justice, hard-won and fiercely guarded, is the only path to redemption. As the cameras clicked and the crowd dispersed, Marcus stood tall, knowing this was merely the first note in a long, defiant song for change. The air in the courthouse buzzed with tension and anticipation as Marcus Avery stood before the crowd, his broad shoulders squared and his dark eyes gleaming with a mixture of resolve and weariness. He had just delivered a speech that cut through the room like a blade, each word carefully chosen, each pause heavy with meaning. "We all carry biases," he had said earlier, his voice steady yet threaded with a quiet urgency that compelled everyone to lean in closer. "It's part of being human, flawed, messy, and tangled up in our own perspectives. But recognizing those biases, that's not a crack in our armor. It's the first brick we lay toward something better. It's how we start to shift things, how we begin to imagine a justice system that doesn't just serve a select few but lifts up everyone." The room had stirred then, a ripple of murmurs spreading through the audience like wind across a still lake. Near the back, a young man with a weary frame and a furrowed brow had been sitting silently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as if wrestling with something unspoken. Finally, he couldn't hold it in any longer. His voice cracked through the hum of the crowd, raw and edged with frustration. "What about the people who've already been chewed up and spit out by this system? Where's the justice for them? What do we do for the ones who've lost everything because of it?" Marcus turned slowly, his gaze locking onto the young man's. For a moment, he didn't speak, his face etched with a solemnity that seemed to carry the weight of every story he'd ever heard, every tear-stained letter he'd read from those wronged by the very system meant to protect them. "That's the part that keeps me up at night," he admitted, his tone softening but never wavering. "We can't rewind time. We can't erase the scars, physical, emotional, or otherwise, that the system has carved into people's lives. But what we can do is fight like hell to make sure it doesn't keep happening. We can push for real repair, overturning convictions that never should have stood, offering restitution to those who've been crushed under the weight of unfairness, and dragging those responsible out into the light to answer for what they've done. Most of all, we can build something new, something that stops these wounds from being inflicted in the first place." He paused, letting the words settle into the room like dust after a storm. Then, with a faint spark of determination flickering in his eyes, he added, "But it's not a solo mission. This isn't just my fight or yours, it's ours. Every cop walking a beat, every lawmaker scribbling on a bill, every citizen who's ever cast a vote or raised a voice, we're all in this together. It's going to take every single one of us to reshape this system into what it should be, not what it's been allowed to become." The reporters perched at the edges of their seats, pens poised and cameras humming, could feel the shift in the air. Marcus's voice dropped then, low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "The justice system isn't broken," he said, each syllable deliberate and piercing. "It's working exactly as it was meant to. That's the gut punch we need to face. It was built on a bedrock of inequality, cemented with old prejudices and power imbalances. And until we tear it down and start over, true justice will always be just out of reach. That's the battle I'm in, for it, to settle scores, not to point fingers for the sake of punishment, but to hold up a mirror and demand we all do better. Accountability isn't revenge, it's the foundation of change." A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd, some clapping softly while others nodded, their faces tight with thought. Marcus stepped back from the microphones, his message hanging in the air like a challenge. But before he turned away, he leaned forward one last time, his voice cutting through the din with unwavering clarity. "Holding people to account doesn't weaken you, it's what makes us stronger. Justice isn't some finish line we cross and call it a day. It's a road we walk, step by step, together. And if we're not all on that journey, then we're not really going anywhere." With that, he stepped back, his tall frame still radiating authority as he melted into the sea of faces, leaving behind a courtroom buzzing with the echoes of his words. Those words didn't just bounce off the walls, they sank into the hearts of everyone there, stirring questions that wouldn't let go. People shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, wondering what their own hands had built or broken in this sprawling, flawed system and what they might do to mend it. As Marcus descended the courthouse steps, each footfall deliberate and heavy with the day's burdens, a swarm of reporters and onlookers surged forward, their voices clashed in a chaotic symphony, microphones thrusting toward him like spears, cameras flashing in a relentless strobe. He paused halfway down, raising a hand to hush the clamor, his presence a steady anchor amid the storm. One reporter, a sharp-eyed woman with a notepad clutched tightly in her grip, broke through the noise first. "Mr. Avery," she called, her voice slicing cleanly through the chaos. "Do you think today's ruling will spark real change?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression calm, but layered with a quiet intensity that hinted at the storm of thoughts beneath. "Real change doesn't ride in on the back of one decision," he said, his voice rising effortlessly above the chatter. "Today was a damn important one, but it's just the beginning. If we want progress that lasts, it's not enough to point at one case and say, 'There, we fixed it.' We've got to rip open the whole idea of justice, turn it inside out, and ask what it's really supposed to mean. That's where the real work starts." Another voice piped up, this one from a weary man with a microphone and a skeptical tilt to his brow. "What changes do you think we need most?" Marcus didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "First off, transparency," he said, ticking off the points on his fingers like a man who'd rehearsed this list in his mind 1,000 times. Every choice made by those in power, whether it's a cop on the corner or a judge behind the bench, needs to be laid bare for everyone to see. No shadows, no excuses. Second, training that's some half-hearted checklist to make people feel good, but deep, honest work to root out the biases we don't even know we're carrying and the systemic rot we've let fester. And third, trust. We've got to rebuild it from the ground up, and that means sitting down with the communities who've been battered by this system the most, listening to them, working with them, not steamrolling over them like they don't matter. The crowd hummed with reaction. Some heads bobbed in quiet agreement. Others scribbled furiously as if trying to capture every breath he took. A third reporter, a stocky man with a weathered face, stepped forward, his tone probing. "Officer Grant apologized today. Do you buy it? Was it genuine?" Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not in anger, but in careful consideration. An apology is a start," he said, his voice measured but firm. "But sincerity's just a pretty word if nothing grows from it. What matters is what Officer Grant does next. Does he look in the mirror and reckon with what he's done? Does he let this crack him open and push him to change? Or does it just drift away like smoke? Another empty sorry lost in the wind. That's the test." He straightened, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "But this isn't just about him. It's about every officer, every prosecutor, every piece of this machine that's let bias twist its gears. We can't keep shrugging off harm as just how it works. If the system's warped, then it's on us to straighten it out." The question lingered, unanswered yet somehow heavier for it, as the reporters scratched their notes with renewed vigor. Then a young journalist, barely out of her 20s, raised a tentative hand, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of her question. "Mr. Avery, some folks say cases like yours are outliers, that they don't show what the system's really like. What do you say to them?" Marcus turned to her, his expression hardening with a fierce clarity. "I'd say they're dead wrong," he replied, his voice ringing out like a bell. "This isn't some rare glitch, it's the damn blueprint. For too many people, what happened to me is the norm, not the exception. The only thing that set me apart was a little luck, a platform, and the means to claw my way through the fight. But what about the ones who don't have that? The ones who get drowned out before they can even shout? Where's their shot at justice?" The young woman nodded, her face softening with a mix of awe and reflection as she jotted down his words. Marcus reached the final step, turning to face the full swell of the crowd, his voice rising just enough to pull every eye and ear toward him. "Justice isn't a prize we win and stick on a shelf," he said, his tone commanding yet laced with an almost pleading urgency. "It's a path we've got to walk every day, all of us. We can't just yell for others to fix it. We've got to turn that lens on ourselves. What baggage are we dragging along, prejudices we don't even see? What parts of this mess have we propped up without thinking? And what are we really doing to make it right?" The crowd fell silent, his words sinking deep, stirring something restless and resolute in their chests. "Accountability isn't about tearing people down," he went on, his voice softening but no less powerful. "It's about lifting us all up. It's about crafting a system that doesn't just work for the ones who fit the mold, but for every single soul caught in its reach. Because if we let it keep failing, we're not just letting down a few, we're betraying the whole damn promise of what justice is supposed to be." A cameraman, sweat beading on his brow from holding his rig steady, called out, "Do you think the public's got a hand in this?" Marcus turned to him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Absolutely, he said, his tone warming with conviction. The public isn't just watching from the bleachers, they're in the game. Every ballot they cast, every sign they hoist at a protest, every late-night talk about what's wrong and how to fix it's where the tide turns. Change doesn't sprout in some sterile office. It grows when people stand up and say enough, when they refuse to swallow the same old excuses. The murmurs swelled again, louder now, as heads nodded and eyes glinted with a mix of hope and determination. Marcus raised his voice just a touch more, ensuring it carried to the edges of the gathering. "We can't sit back and wait," he said, his words sharp and unyielding. "Complacency is the fertilizer that lets injustice bloom. It's what keeps rotten policies and quiet bigotries alive, unchecked and unchallenged. If we want a system that's fair, a system that's just, we've got to roll up our sleeves and fight for it. And that fight, it doesn't wrap up neat and tidy in a courtroom. That's just where it kicks off." An older reporter, her graying hair pulled back tightly and a notebook worn soft from years of use cradled in her hands, stepped forward. "Mr. Avery," she said, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "After everything you've been through, years of battling the system, what keeps you holding on to hope?" Marcus paused, his gaze drifting upward for a moment as if searching the sky for an answer. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost tender, but brimming with a quiet fire. "What keeps me hopeful is knowing we're not stuck. We can grow. We can look at ourselves as we look and decide to be better. I've seen it in the faces of people who've lost everything but still show up to speak. I've heard it in the voices of kids who believe tomorrow doesn't have to look like today. That's what keeps me going, the stubborn, beautiful truth that we're capable of change. And if we can change, then we can build something worth believing in." With that, he stepped away, his figure receding into the crowd. But his presence lingered like a torch passed from hand to hand. The reporters dispersed slowly, their notebooks heavy with his words, while the onlookers stood in small clusters, voices low and earnest as they wrestled with what they'd heard. Among them was the young man from the back of the room, his hands now unclenched, his eyes fixed on the spot where Marcus had stood. He didn't speak, but the set of his jaw said he'd carry this moment with him, Abe, to a protest, maybe to a voting booth, maybe to a quiet corner where he'd ask himself the hard questions Marcus had laid bare. Down the street, Officer Grant lingered near his patrol car, the echo of his own halting apology still ringing in his ears. He'd meant eat at least. He thought he had, but Marcus's words gnawed at him. "What comes next?" He kicked at a pebble on the pavement, his broad face creased with unease. He'd always seen himself as one of the good ones, but now he wondered what that even meant in a system so tangled with flaws. The thought of facing his precinct tomorrow, of meeting the eyes of colleagues who'd watched him stumble, made his stomach twist. But deeper still, there was a flicker of fragile, unsteady hope that maybe this could be his chance to do more than apologize, to step into the journey Marcus had described. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone there. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from on high. It was a garden cultivated through sweat, scrutiny, and sacrifice. And when power was wielded without care, when it crushed instead of uplifted, the consequences rippled far beyond the courtroom, staining lives and legacies alike. Marcus's fight wasn't just for himself, it was a clarion call, a reminder that the cost of abusing authority was a debt paid by all, and the pursuit of fairness was a burden they couldn't afford to shrug off. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, the crowd began to drift away, each carrying a piece of that truth, each a little more awake to the road ahead. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps where Marcus Avery stood, his silhouette framed against the weathered stone facade. A restless crowd buzzed around him, reporters with microphones poised like drawn swords, onlookers whispering in tight clusters, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty. His briefcase dangled from one hand, its leather edges worn from years of battles fought in rooms just like the one he'd left behind. The air thrummed with anticipation as he raised a hand, a simple gesture that silenced the clamor in an instant. His dark eyes swept over the sea of faces, steady and piercing, locking onto the nearest camera lens as if peering straight into the soul of every viewer beyond it. "The story," he began, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade honed by resolve. "Isn't mine alone. It belongs to every single one of us. It's a wake-up call, a reminder that justice isn't some gift dropped into our laps. It's a structure we carve out, brick by brick, day after day, through sweat and sacrifice." Inside his chest, his heart beat a steady rhythm, though beneath his calm exterior churned a storm of emotions. Relief that the trial was over, exhaustion from the weight of it all, and a fragile ember of hope he dared not let flicker out. He thought of the faces in the courtroom earlier, the jurors who'd shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the judge whose gavel had fallen with a thud that echoed in his bones. Marcus knew the stakes went far beyond his own fate. This was about the countless others who'd never get their day in court, whose voices had been smothered by a system too often wielded as a weapon against the powerless. "Change," he continued, his tone rising with a quiet ferocity, "doesn't ride in on the back of one verdict or a hollow apology from someone caught red-handed. It grows from the hard questions we force ourselves to face. What lies have I swallowed? What gears in this machine have I oiled with my silence? And what am I right now willing to do to tear it down and build something better?" The crowd stood transfixed, the weight of his words settling over them like dust after a storm. A young reporter, her auburn hair spilling over her shoulders, stepped forward, her notepad clutched tight. "Mr. Avery," she said, her voice sharp but tinged with reverence. "Do you really think this case will spark reform?" Marcus turned to her, his gaze softening for a moment as he read the earnestness in her eyes. She wasn't just fishing for a soundbite, she was searching for something to believe in. "That's up to us," he replied, his voice firm yet laced with a challenge. "This moment could be a spark, or it could fizzle out into nothing if we let it. Accountability's just the first step, not the finish line. We need roots deeper than promise, training that rewires how power is held, oversight with teeth, and a promise of fairness that's more than ink on a page." Her pen danced across her notepad, capturing every syllable, her brow furrowed as if she could already see the headline taking shape. Another question came, this time from a weary man with a press badge dangling crookedly from his jacket. "What about the folks who say the system's too massive, too rooted to ever budge?" Marcus didn't hesitate, his jaw tightening as he leaned into the words. "No system's a monolith. It's just people, flawed, stubborn, breathing people, and people can change it, reshape it, break it apart if they have to. But it starts with us owning our part, not just shaking our fists at the shadows. It means hearing the ones who've been crushed under its weight, and doing more than nodding along." Whacked. The man scribbled furiously, his lips twitching into a faint, approving smirk as he backed away. Behind Marcus, the courthouse loomed, its towering columns and chipped marble steps a silent witness to the day's upheaval. Hours earlier, the room inside had been a cauldron of tension, attorneys pacing with clipped strides, papers rustling like dry leaves, voices clashing in a symphony of accusation and defense. Now, as he'd walked away from the defendant's table, the space had fallen into an eerie hush, the kind that follows a thunderclap. The wooden benches stretched out in neat rows, scuffed and scarred from decades of restless spectators. The judge's bench, elevated and austere, seemed to loom larger in the stillness, its polished surface catching the faint glow of the overhead lights. Marcus had gathered his belongings with a deliberate slowness, each motion a quiet defiance against the chaos that had unfolded. His face, a mask of composure, hid the torrent inside: pride at standing his ground, anger at the necessity of it, and a gnawing fear that this victory might be a fleeting gasp in a suffocating fight. A few stragglers had lingered in the gallery, their whispers buzzing like static. Among them, a man in a crisp navy suit approached, his polished shoes tapping hesitantly against the hardwood floor. He was middle-aged, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, but his eyes carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too many scales tip unjustly. "Mr. Avery," he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if testing the waters before diving in. "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did today, it wasn't just about saving yourself. You held a mirror up to all of us, made us question the things we've let slide for too long. It's a lot to chew on." Marcus paused, his fingers resting on the clasp of his briefcase, and looked up. The man's sincerity struck him, a rare thread of connection in a day woven with conflict. "I appreciate that," he said, his tone even but warm, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his guarded demeanor. The man shifted his weight, then pressed on. I'm in the legal game myself, decades of it. I've watched people get steamrolled because they didn't have the means to push back. Seeing you stand there, immovable, it's burned into me. I won't shake it off anytime soon. Marcus offered a faint nod, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. The system doesn't budge unless we shove it, he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. That's on all of you, especially the ones like you, working inside its walls. We've got to keep asking, keep challenging, keep holding it to the fire. The man's face softened, a thoughtful crease forming between his brows. You've lit a spark in a lot of folks today, he said, stepping back into the dimness of the emptying room, his silhouette fading as if reluctant to let the moment go. Across the courtroom, a young woman emerged from the shadows, her steps tentative but purposeful. She was one of the reporters who'd lingered, her navy blazer slightly wrinkled from hours of waiting, her notebook clutched like a lifeline. Mr. Avery, she began, her voice trembling with a mix of nerves and admiration. I wanted to thank you for being so raw out there. You've given words to people who've never had the chance to speak. Marcus studied her for a moment, noting the way her eyes shone with quiet resolve. She reminded him of himself years ago, hungry for truth, teetering on the edge of disillusionment. That's a duty we all carry, he replied, his tone gentle but firm. To speak when others can't, to stand when sitting feels safer. She held his gaze for a heartbeat, then nodded, her pen scratching across the page as she turned and hurried out, her footsteps a staccato echo in the vast room. As Marcus moved toward the towering double doors, a burly figure stepped into his path, bailiff, his broad shoulders filling the space, his stern face softened by an unexpected warmth. Mr. Avery, he said, his voice a low rumble, almost shy. I've been at this gig 20 years, seen cases pile up, heard every argument under the sun. But what you laid out today, he shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That hit me square, got me thinking hard. Marcus stopped, meeting the man's gaze, surprised by the vulnerability in those weathered eyes. That's the seed of it, he said quietly. It starts with USIAC of US mulling over what we can do different, better. The bailiff nodded, his expression hardening into something resolute. I hope you're right, he murmured, stepping aside with a dip of his head, his meaty hand resting briefly on the doorframe as Marcus passed. The courtroom was nearly deserted now, save for a lone janitor sweeping the floor, his broom whispering against the wood in rhythmic strokes. Marcus cast a final glance. Around the spaced walls lined with faded portraits of stern-faced judges, the benches bearing the ghosts of countless stories, the judges perched standing like a sentinel over it all. It looked unchanged, yet the air crackled with something new, a shift born from the words and revelations that had spilled forth that day. The trial was over, its verdict sealed, but its ripples were only beginning to spread, lapping at the edges of a wider world. Every argument, every unflinching truth he'd spoken, had etched itself not just into the room but into the minds of those who'd heard it, a quiet promise of conversations yet to come. At the threshold, a voice called out, frail but insistent, Mr. Avery. He turned to see an older woman, one of the last spectators, clutching her handbag with gnarled hands. Her face was a map of wrinkles, etched by time and wisdom, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I just had to say thank you, she said, her voice quivering but strong, for telling it straight, for not bending when it got tough. Marcus inclined his head, respect softening his features. Thank you for hearing me, he replied, his words simple but heavy with meaning. She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek, then turned and shuffled away, her steps slow but steady, as if carrying his words with her into the fading light. Stepping outside, the sunlight washed over him, warm and golden, a stark contrast to the cool shadows of the courtroom. Yet the day's burden clung to him, a mantle of responsibility he couldn't shed. The crowd surged forward again, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus, but Marcus stood tall, his presence a quiet command. He knew this was no ending, just a skirmish in a sprawling war for something truer, something fairer. The path ahead stretched out, uncertain and jagged, but in the stillness that followed the storm. Amid the echoes of changed hearts and stirred consciences, Marcus carried a spark. It wasn't just hope, it was a call, a challenge, a vow that justice, fragile and hard-won, was worth every step of the fight. The air trembled with a palpable tension as Marcus Avery stood before the throng of onlookers, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of the moment. His voice, a deep timbre that carried both resolve and exhaustion, softened as he paused, letting his gaze sweep across the sea of face reporters with their notebooks poised, citizens clutching signs, and activists whose eyes burned with hope. Change, he began. The word hanging heavy in the air is never a simple thing to grasp. It's a jagged, uphill climb, riddled with obstacles. But it's not just necessary, it's within our reach. His tone grew tender yet retained an unshakable strength, like a weathered oak bending, but never breaking in a storm. What happened here today proves it. We've cast a searing light on the cracks in our system, and instead of turning our heads, we faced them head-on. That's a triumph worth celebrating. But let's be clear, this is only the first step on a long road. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and a reporter's voice pierced the quiet, sharp and insistent. "What's next for you, Mr. Avery?" Marcus stilled, his dark eyes narrowing as he sifted through the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. The question wasn't new, but it carried a fresh weight now. With the cameras rolling and the world watching, he exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the crisp afternoon air, then leaned forward into the microphone. "What's next hasn't changed," he said, his words deliberate, each one landing like a stone dropped into still water. "It's what's always been next, fighting tooth and nail for a system that doesn't pick and choose who gets fairness, a system blind to race, blind to background, blind to circumstance. Today, we held one officer accountable, dragged his actions into the open for all to see. But tomorrow demands something bigger. It demands accountability from every single one of us. That's where the real battle begins, the one that'll test our souls." The reporters exchanged quick, knowing glances, their pens scratching furiously against paper, capturing every syllable as Marcus stepped back from the podium. His broad frame cast a shadow over the wooden platform, and he turned his attention to the crowd beyond the flashing cameras. These weren't just faceless spectators. They were the heartbeat of this moment, ordinary people drawn by the gravity of what had unfolded. Mothers clutching their children's hands, young men with clenched fists, elderly women with tears glistening in their eyes. "This isn't about me," Marcus said, his voice rising to reach them, raw with conviction. "It's about us, about the kind of world we're willing to forge together. Do we settle for a society where justice is a rare gift, doled out to the privileged few? Or do we demand a world where justice is a birthright, within reach of every single soul?" That's the crossroads we're standing at right now. The crowd fell into a hushed reverence, every ear straining to catch his next words. Marcus drew a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he let the silence stretch, giving them time to feel the weight of his message. When he spoke again, his voice softened, threading vulnerability through his iron resolve. "It begins in moments like this, moments where we say enough to the way things have always been, where we dare ourselves to rise above complacency. Justice isn't some happy accident that falls into our laps. It's a deliberate choice, a fire we stoke with our actions." He turned briefly to the cameras, his gaze piercing through the lenses to the unseen masses beyond. "If this story stirs something in you, don't let it fade into the noise of your day. Carry it with you, speak it aloud, act on it. The fight for justice isn't a solo journey, it's a path we all walk, and it's one we can't afford to abandon." A smattering of applause broke out, tentative at first, then swelling into a quiet roar as Marcus stepped away. Some cheered softly, their voices mingling with the rustle of leaves overhead. He moved toward the street, the sunlight spilling warm and golden across his path, his briefcase swinging lightly in his hand. The weight of the day clung to him like damp cloth, but beneath it burned a flicker of hope. He knew the systems he'd challenged today were ancient, stubborn giants. Their roots sunk deep into the earth. Change wouldn't come swiftly or without a fight. Resistance would rear its head at every turn. Yet Marcus felt the shift. Seeds had been sown. Quiet conversations sparked in homes and street corners, minds pried open to new possibilities. This wasn't just a courtroom victory, it was a clarion call, a reminder that justice faltered when power went unchecked, and that true accountability was the bedrock of a fair world. As he walked, the morning's earlier events replayed in his mind, vivid and unrelenting. Charlotte had dawned under a heavy shroud of gray, the sky a thick quilt of clouds that seemed to press down on the city. A steady drizzle tapped against the windshield of Marcus Wright's black SUV as he maneuvered it into a cramped parking spot near the Memorial Parkside Clinic. It wasn't ideal, too close to the curb, too far from the entrance, but Marcus barely noticed. His thoughts were tethered to his daughter, Alicia, a fragile 14-year-old whose life had been upended by lupus. Diagnosed just months ago, she'd grown weaker with each passing week, her bright spirit dimming under the strain of illness and medication. That morning's checkup had been a grueling ordeal, not because of bad news the doctor had assured him her condition was stable, but because of the relentless uncertainty gnawing at Marcus's core. The side effects of her drugs were piling up, a cruel tax on her small body, and he felt powerless in a way no battlefield had ever made him feel. Stepping out of the SUV, he pulled his jacket tighter against the chill, the damp air seeping into his bones. Dressed in dark jeans, a blue polo, and a lightweight coat, he felt like a stranger outside the military uniform that had defined him for over 3 decades. That uniform, adorned with medals and the insignia of a colonel, lay folded in the trunk, a relic of a life where control and discipline had been his armor. Now, he was just a father, grappling with a foe he couldn't outmaneuver or outlast. Across the street, Officer Travis Walker sat slouched in his patrol car, cradling a cup of coffee that had long since lost its warmth. At 28, Travis was a weary figure with sharp cheekbones and a restless energy that bordered on reckless. His face flickered between a cocky smirk and a simmering unease. A man desperate to carve his name into the world. In the Charlotte Police Department, opinions about him split like a fault line. Some admired his zeal. Others bristled at his impulsiveness, whispering about the chip on his shoulder. Beside him, Pete Andrews, his partner for the day, lounged in the passenger seat, his weathered face lit by the glow of a tablet. Older and seasoned, Pete had seen enough to let the small stuff slide. He glanced up as Marcus climbed out of the SUV, his gray eyes narrowing briefly before he shrugged. "Just some guy in a parking zone, probably running late," Pete muttered, his voice gravelly and bored, before returning to his screen. But Travis's gaze lingered, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Something about the polished black SUV and the man emerging from it, a tall, composed figure with an air of quiet authority grated on him. He tapped his fingers restlessly, a drumbeat of agitation. "I'm gonna check it out," he announced, swinging the door open before Pete could protest. "Walker, don't waste time on a parking ticket," Pete sighed, barely looking up. "We've got real work to do." But Travis was already gone, striding through the rain, his hand hovering near his holster as if expecting trouble. Minutes later, Marcus emerged from the clinic, his mind a tangle of worry and resolve. The doctor's assurances rang hollow against the image of Alicia's pale face, her small hands trembling as she gripped his arm. He quickened his pace toward the SUV, needing to return to her, to be the steady rock she leaned on even if he felt his own strength crumbling. "Sir," the voice sliced through the drizzle, sharp and commanding, stopping Marcus mid-step. He turned to see Travis approaching, his posture rigid, rain streaking down his uniform. The young officer's eyes were hard, his jaw set. "This your vehicle?" Travis asked, jerking his head toward the SUV. Marcus nodded, his voice steady despite the weariness pulling at him. "Yes, officer." The exchange hung there, a spark waiting to ignite, a moment where power and vulnerability collided, where the lesson of justice's fragility began to unfold. The drizzle had just begun to kiss the pavement when Marcus Wright, a man whose broad shoulders carried the weight of 3 decades of military service, pointed toward the sleek black SUV parked neatly in a regular zone. "There it is," he said, his voice calm yet threaded with quiet pride as he dangled the car keys in his hand. The raindrops glistened on the metal, catching the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. He turned to face the young officer, Travis, expecting a routine exchange, perhaps a nod, a quick glance at the vehicle, and a parting word. Instead, Travis's sharp demand sliced through the damp air like a jagged blade. "I need to see your identification, vehicle registration, and proof of permission to park here." Marcus's brow furrowed, a ripple of confusion stirring beneath his composed exterior. The hostility in Travis's tone felt like an unprovoked jab, a spark igniting a tension Marcus hadn't anticipated. Rain tapped softly against his jacket as he drew a steadying breath, years of discipline anchoring him. "I understand, officer," he began, his words measured, deliberate. "But I was only inside for a few minutes. My daughter has a medical condition, and I needed to." "Did I ask for an explanation?" Travis snapped, his voice cutting through Marcus's like a whip cracking against the wind. "Just show me your ID." The interruption stung, a barb that pricked at Marcus's patience. Inside, a flicker of frustration flared, but he smothered it, reaching instead for the SUV's door handle. "Let me grab my wallet," he said, his tone still even. "It's inside." The moment the door creaked open, Travis's hand darted to his holstered weapon with the speed of a predator sensing prey. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, his shout reverberating down the quiet street. Bouncing off brick walls and parked cars, Marcus froze, the cold metal of the door handle biting into his palm. His heart thudded, not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity of the moment. Slowly, he raised his hands, palms open to the gray sky, rain trickling down his wrists. Around him, the world seemed to pause. Pedestrians halted mid-step, their heads swiveling toward the scene. Across the street, a woman in a bright red coat fumbled for her phone, her jaw dropping as she whispered something to the man beside her. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice a steady anchor amid the rising storm, "there's no need for this. I'm just reaching for my wallet, nothing more." But Travis's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the gun still nestled in its holster. "You don't make the rules here," he shot back, his voice laced with defiance. "I said hands up, don't move." Marcus obeyed, standing motionless as the rain began to fall harder, soaking through his clothes, plastering his shirt to his skin. The crowd grew a cluster of onlookers clutching umbrellas and shopping bags, their murmurs swelling like a chorus of disbelief. "I'm Colonel Marcus Wright," he said at last, his voice rising with a quiet authority that carried the weight of his years. "I've served this country for over 30 years. I'm simply trying to—" "I don't care who you are," Travis interrupted, his pitch climbing, his words dripping with disdain. "You're a suspect in a suspicious vehicle, and I'm not taking any chances." The word suspect landed like a punch to Marcus's gut. Humiliation seeped in, a slow burn creeping up his neck, prickling beneath his skin. For decades, he had fought in battlefields, in boardrooms, against prejudice or unrespect, to carve out a place in a nation that too often saw him through a lens of suspicion. And now, here he was, hands raised in the rain, his rank, his service, his very identity reduced to nothing in the shadow of Travis's unchecked power. "Get on your knees," Travis ordered, his gun now fully drawn, the barrel glinting ominously under the streetlights. Marcus's breath caught, his mind reeling. The command felt like a violation, a stripping away of everything he'd built. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a tide of voices rising in protest. A young man with a backpack slung over one shoulder stepped forward, his voice cracking with outrage. "Hey, what are you doing?" He's not resisting. Others joined in, phones raised like torches, their cameras capturing every agonizing second. A woman in a blue scarf shouted, "Are you serious right now? He's a military officer." Another voice, older and gruff, added, "Yeah, and this is how we treat our veterans?" Marcus hesitated, the weight of their words mingling with the cold rain soaking his skin. "Officer, this isn't necessary," he said softly, a plea wrapped in dignity. But Travis's face twisted with frustration. "On your knees," he repeated, his voice a thunderclap. Swallowing the bitter taste of pride, Marcus lowered himself to the pavement. His knees sank into the wet, gritty concrete, the chill seeping into his bones. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the biting cold and the sting of disgrace. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, dripped into his eyes. But it was the heat of shame that burned deepest, a fire no downpour could extinguish. The crowd's outrage swelled, a symphony of disbelief and anger. Marcus felt their eyes on him, their voices weaving a fragile shield round his dignity. Yet inside, a storm regained a torrent of memories crashing against the present. The times he'd been pulled over for no reason, the store clerks who'd trailed him down aisles, the neighbors who'd questioned his presence in his own home. All those moments he'd buried beneath medals and promotions. He'd told himself those battles were behind him, that his service had rewritten the narrative. But now, kneeling in the rain, hands raised like a defeated soldier, he saw the truth. Justice was a fragile thread, easily severed by those who wielded power without restraint. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the crowd's hum intensified. Phones gleamed through the mist, recording the sight of Colonel Marcus Wright, a decorated hero. A father, a man who'd faced death in distant lands, reduced to this. His breaths came slow, deliberate, a rhythm honed in combat zones. He'd stared down enemies, made life or death calls in the chaos of war, but this was no battlefield. This was home, a place where he'd expected safety, respect. Instead, he knelt, stripped bare by the reckless authority of a young cop who saw threat where there was none. Suddenly, a sharp voice cleaved through the chaos. "Walker, what the hell are you doing?" It was commanding, unyielding, a blade slicing through the tension. Travis flinched, his head jerking slightly, but his gun remained steady. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw her Sergeant Elizabeth Carter, striding toward them from a second patrol car that had screeched to a halt nearby. She was a towering figure, mid-40s, her dark brown hair pulled into a tight bun that defied the rain. Her uniform was crisp despite the weather, her presence radiating a quiet power that shifted the scene's gravity. "Ma'am," Travis stammered, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "I've got the situation under control." "Under control." Elizabeth's tone was a whip, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the tableau. Marcus on his knees, hands aloft, surrounded by a growing throng of witnesses. "This is what you call control." Her gaze softened briefly as it landed on Marcus, a flicker of empathy breaking through her professional mask. "Sir," she said, her voice gentler now, "please stand up." Travis whirled toward her, his face a storm of confusion and defiance. "With all due respect, Sergeant, I can't let him stand until I confirm he's not a threat." Elizabeth's eyes snapped back to him, cold as steel. "A threat? He's unarmed, kneeling in the rain, surrounded by witnesses. What part of that screams threat to you?" Travis faltered, his grip tightening on his weapon, his knuckles whitening. "I don't trust him," he muttered, the words slipping out like a confession. Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You don't trust him? Or you don't trust the way he looks?" The question hung there heavy, a challenge Travis couldn't escape. His mouth opened, then snapped shut, his face flushing a deep crimson. "Put the weapon down," she ordered, her tone brooking no dissent. For a moment, Travis hesitated, his jaw clenching, his fingers twitching on the grip. The rain fell harder, a relentless drumbeat underscoring the standoff. Marcus watched, his knees still pressed into the pavement, the cold seeping deeper. But in that moment, he felt a shift, a glimmer of hope amid the indignity. Elizabeth's presence was a lifeline, a reminder that justice, though flawed, could still prevail. Travis's power had run unchecked, a reckless force fueled by bias. But here was its counterweight, a woman who saw through the haze, who wielded authority with clarity and restraint. The lesson burned clear: in Marcus's mind, power without accountability was a poison, and its consequences rippled far beyond the one who knelt in the rain. The air hung heavy with tension as he stood there, rain-soaked and resolute, his fingers tightening momentarily round the grip of his weapon. For a fleeting second, it seemed as though he might defy the growing pressure bearing down on him from all sides. Sharp stares of the crowd, the glint of phone cameras capturing every twitch of his expression, the weight of his own conscience gnawing at him. But then, with a slow, reluctant exhale that seemed to drag the very air from his lungs, he lowered the gun. His movements were deliberate, almost pained, as he slid it back into its holster, the metallic click swallowed by the murmurs rippling through the onlookers. A collective breath escaped the crowd, a shaky sigh of relief that did little to unravel the knot of unease still pulsing through the street. The rain glistened on the pavement, reflecting the dim streetlights, and though the downpour had begun to lighten, the atmosphere remained thick. charged with the unspoken consequences of what had just unfolded. Elizabeth turned her gaze back to the man standing before her, his broad shoulders squared despite the ordeal he'd just endured. "Colonel Wright," she began, her voice catching slightly as she forced the words out. "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." The phrase felt hollow, bitter even, as it left her lips. A misunderstanding? Her mind recoiled at the inadequacy of the term. This wasn't some simple mix-up born of crossed signals or innocent intent. It was the ugly bloom of prejudice, laid bare for all to see. Yet she swallowed the bile rising in her throat, her jaw tightening as she fought to maintain the composure she knew was expected of her. Every pair of eyes, every flickering phone screen, was trained on her now, recording her every word, her every flinch. She couldn't afford to falter, not here, not with the world watching. Marcus rose to his feet with a slow, measured grace, brushing his wet hands against the rough denim of his jeans. The rainwater streaked down his palms, leaving faint trails on the fabric as he straightened. When his eyes met Elizabeth's, they carried a calm that belied the exhaustion etched into the lines of his facial weariness, that ran deeper than the physical strain of the moment. "Sergeant," he said, his voice steady, resonant, cutting through the damp air with quiet authority. "I'd like my wallet back now." There was no malice in his tone, no trace of the anger that would have been justified. Only a tired request laced with the weight of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised by this. Elizabeth gave a curt nod, her eyes flicking toward Travis, who stood a few paces away, his posture rigid with defiance. She gestured sharply for him to comply, and Travis hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line as though the act of obedience stung his pride. With a grudging slowness, he bent down to retrieve the wallet from where it had fallen during the chaos, the leather sodden and mud-streaked from the wet asphalt. He handed it over to Marcus with a stiff motion, his fingers lingering on it for a split second longer than necessary, as if relinquishing it meant surrendering something more. Marcus took the wallet without a word, flipping it open with a practiced ease. He pulled out his military ID, the laminated card catching the faint glow of a nearby street lamp as he held it up for Elizabeth to see. The embossed letters gleamed faintly. "Colonel Marcus Wright." Elizabeth's voice was steady as she read it aloud, though a flicker of recognition danced across her features, widening her eyes for a brief moment. She knew that name. Most people in her line of work, law enforcement, military, did. Marcus Wright wasn't just a name. He was a legacy, a decorated officer whose career spanned decades, a man whose valor had earned him medals, accolades, and the quiet reverence of those who'd served alongside him. The realization hit her like a cold wave, sharpening her focus as she turned to Travis, her expression hardening into something unyielding. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Her voice sliced through the air, sharp and accusing, reverberating off the wet buildings lining the street. The crowd stirred, their murmurs swelling as her words sank in. Travis shifted on his feet, discomfort radiating from him like heat off pavement. "No, ma'am," he muttered, his tone defensive, "but I don't see how that matters." "It matters," Elizabeth snapped, cutting him off before he could finish, her voice rising with a force that drew every eye in the vicinity. "Because you just drew your weapon on a national hero." The accusation hung there, heavy and undeniable, as the onlookers began to whisper among themselves, their voices a low hum of shock and indignation. Travis's face flushed a deeper crimson, the color creeping up his neck as he struggled to hold her gaze, his defiance crumbling under the weight of her words. Marcus raised a hand then, the gesture calm but commanding, silencing the murmurs as effectively as a gavel strike. "Sergeant Carter," he said, turning to Elizabeth, his tone measured yet carrying an undercurrent of steel. "If I may." Her jaw tightened, but she nodded, yielding the floor to him. He took a breath, his chest rising and falling as he gathered his thoughts, then continued, "I appreciate your apology, truly, but this isn't about who I am. It shouldn't take being a national hero for someone to be treated with basic dignity. I could have been anyone assown without a title, without a rank, and I still wouldn't have deserved this." His words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Heads nodded, voices murmured in agreement, and a few onlookers called out affirmations, their support cutting through the damp air. Elizabeth's expression softened, just for a moment, a crack in her armor as she met his gaze. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the fading patter of the rain. "You're absolutely right." The admission cost her something. She felt it in the tightness of her chest, the sting of shame that came with recognizing her own complicity in a system that had allowed this to happen. But Travis wasn't ready to let it go. He stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his voice rising with a stubborn edge. "With all due respect, ma'am," he interjected, "I was just doing my job. I followed procedure. How was I supposed to know he wasn't a threat?" Marcus turned to him then, his eyes locking onto Travis's with an intensity that seemed to pin the younger man in place. The quiet power in his stare was unnerving, stripping away the bravado Travis clung to. "You didn't see a man," Marcus said, his voice low and piercing, each word deliberate. "You saw a black man in a nice car, and you made a decision before I even opened my mouth. That's not procedure. That's prejudice." The truth of it landed hard, cutting through the excuses Travis had been ready to wield. His face darkened further, his mouth opening as if to argue, but no words came. The weight of Marcus's gaze held him silent, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. "Enough, Walker," Elizabeth barked, her tone sharp enough to snap him out of his stupor. "You've done enough." The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving the street slick and shining under the streetlights, a mirror reflecting the fractured scene. The crowd began to thin, some drifting away with shouts of encouragement for Marcus. "Stay strong, brother," while others shot venomous glares at Travis as they passed. But many stayed, their phones still raised, capturing every second of the fallout. Elizabeth pulled Travis aside, her grip firm on his arm as she lowered her voice to a fierce whisper. "You're done for today. Hand me your badge and your weapon." His eyes widened, shock flashing across his face as he stammered. "What, Sergeant? You can't." "I can, and I just did," she cut in, her tone brooking no argument. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. We'll be reviewing this incident, and I'll tell you now it doesn't look good for you." Travis stood frozen, his breath hitching as the reality sank in. His hands trembled as he unholstered his gun and unclipped his badge, passing them to her with a reluctance that bordered on desperation. The metal felt cold in Elizabeth's palm, heavier than it should have, a tangible reminder of the power he'd misused. As she turned back to Marcus, the weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake, it was about a system that kept failing over and over, letting bias fester until it erupted in moments like this. "Colonel Wright," she said softly, her voice tinged with a quiet resolve. "If there's anything I can do to make this right." Marcus shook his head, a faint, humorless smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You can't undo what's already been done, Sergeant, but you can start by holding your people accountable." With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, his strides steady despite the invisible burden he carried. He slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, the adrenaline finally ebbing away and leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Behind him, the crowd was dispersing at last, their voices fading into the night, but the footage they'd captured was already on its way to igniting a firestorm. By the time Marcus pulled into his driveway that evening, the video had exploded across social media, spreading with a ferocity that outpaced even the rain that had drenched him earlier. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, a relentless chorus of notifications he couldn't bring himself to face. The image of him kneeling in the rain, hands raised, his dignity stripped bare, was now plastered across every news outlet, every platform. His name a rallying cry for justice and a lightning rod for debate. Inside his home, the silence was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. He sank into the armchair in his living room, the walls around him lined with framed memories, photographs of a career defined by service, medals gleaming under glass, handshakes with leaders who'd once called him a hero. Now, those accolades felt like cruel taunts, reminders that none of it had shielded him from the indignity of that moment. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie, soft and tentative against the hardwood floor. He looked up to see Alicia standing in the doorway, her slight frame dwarfed by one of his old army t-shirts, the faded green fabric hanging loose round her shoulders. The hallway light cast a gentle glow behind her, illuminating the loose curls of her dark hair. But her face was pale, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She clutched her phone in one hand, the screen frozen on that damning image of him in the rain. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling as she stepped closer, "why didn't you fight back?" The question hung between them, fragile and raw. A daughter's plea for answers her father wasn't sure he could give. The air in the room felt heavy as Marcus sat on the couch, his chest tightening with every breath he took. His hands, weathered from years of service, trembled slightly as he gestured for Alicia to join him. The faint creak of the floorboards beneath her hesitant steps echoed in the stillness, her reluctance palpable. She paused for a heartbeat, her eyes flickering with uncertainty, before finally giving in. Curling up beside him, she nestled her small frame against his broad shoulder, her head resting there as if seeking shelter from a storm only she could feel brewing. The warmth of her closeness contrasted with the cold ache gnawing at Marcus's heart. "Because, Alicia," he started, his voice low and deliberate, each word carefully measured as though he were stepping through a minefield of his own emotions. "Sometimes fighting back isn't about what you do right then and there. Sometimes it's about how you carry yourself through the wreckage that follows." His throat tightened as he spoke, the weight of his own advice pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Alicia shifted slightly, her breath catching as she whispered, "But he humiliated you." Her voice cracked, fragile and raw, barely holding together under the strain of her indignation. "You didn't do anything wrong, Dad, and he treated you like you were nothing." Tears welled in her eyes, glistening in the dim light of the living room, and Marcus felt them pierce him deeper than any insult ever could. He shut his eyes for a moment, the memory crashing over him like a tidal wave. Travis Walker's voice sharp, venomous, dripping with contempt rang in his ears as clearly as it had the day before. The officer's accusations had sliced through the air, each syllable a calculated jab meant to degrade, to diminish. Marcus could still see the man's sneer, the way his lip curled as if Marcus's very existence offended him. "I know," Marcus murmured, his tone soft, but laced with a quiet pain that refused to be buried. "And it hurt more than I can put into words. But if I'd lashed out, if I'd raised my voice or made one wrong move, do you know what might have happened?" His question hung there, heavy and unanswered, though Alicia's silence spoke louder than any reply, the tears slipping down her cheeks, leaving faint trails on her skin, told him she understood the unspoken danger, the razor-thin line he'd been forced to walk. "Sweetheart," he continued, his voice steadying as he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers brushing against her softer ones. "I've been fighting battles like this my whole life, not just in the deserts and jungles overseas, but right here, in the places that should feel like home." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window where the fading light painted the world in shades of gray. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't throwing a punch or shouting back, it's keeping your head up. When every fiber of you wants to break, staying calm doesn't mean I'm weak, Alicia. It doesn't mean I'm not fighting. It just means I'm choosing a different path to victory, one that doesn't destroy me in the process." Alicia sniffled, dragging the sleeve of her faded sweatshirt across her face, smudging the tears into her skin. "Is that why you didn't say anything about what happened before?" she asked, her voice small but piercing. "Mom told me about that time, years ago, when you got pulled over." Marcus's breath hitched, his body stiffening as if she'd struck a nerve he'd buried deep. He hadn't known Angela had shared that story with her. The memory flooded back unbidden in night years past, the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, the officer's cold, suspicious glare as he demanded to know how Marcus could afford a car that nice, the accusation that he'd stolen Itha's own car, bought with years of hard-earned money, had burned in his chest like wildfire. He'd been furious, his fists clenched so tight his nails had bitten into his palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks. Humiliation had coiled around him like a snake, squeezing until he could barely breathe. Angela's voice had been the tether that kept him from snapping that night. "You just got that promotion," she'd said, her tone urgent, her eyes pleading as they sat at their kitchen table later. "If you push back now, if you file a complaint, it could unravel everything we've built. They'll find a way to turn it against you." Her words had made sense then, practical and grounded, but they'd left a bitter taste in his mouth. So Marcus had swallowed his pride, choking it down like a jagged pill, and let the incident fade into the shadows of his past. But now, sitting here with Alicia's wide, searching eyes fixed on him, he felt the sting of that choice anew. Regret gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. "I didn't speak up then because I was scared," he admitted, the confession spilling out like a dam breaking. "Scared of what it'd do to my career, to our family, to you and your mom. But that was a mistake, Alicia. Staying silent didn't shield me from anything. It just let the poison fester. Let people like that officer think they could keep treating us like we don't matter." His voice trembled with a mix of shame and resolve, and Alicia tilted her head up, her gaze locking onto his. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked, her tone a fragile blend of hope and fear, as if his answer might shape the world she'd grow into. Marcus faltered, his mind a tangled mess of anger, exhaustion, and uncertainty. He'd been so consumed by the fresh wound of Travis Walker's words that he hadn't mapped out what came next. But as he looked into his daughter's face, her eyes brimming with trust, her lips quivering with unspoken questions, she knew he couldn't retreat into silence again. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, his hand tightening around hers. "But I promise you this, I'm going to do something. I won't let this be the end of it." The next morning, the world outside Marcus's quiet home erupted into chaos. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the coffee table, a swarm of notifications lighting up the screen, calls from journalists hungry for a soundbite, colleagues offering cautious support, even strangers hurling opinions he didn't ask for. He let most of them go unanswered, the noise grating against his frayed nerves. But one name stopped him cold: General Harold Bennett. Harold had been more than a mentor. He'd been a lighthouse in the storm of Marcus's early career. A gruff, no-nonsense man whose respect Marcus had fought tooth and nail to earn. With a steadying breath, he answered. "Marcus," Harold's voice rumbled through the line, familiar and weathered like an old oak. "I saw the video." Marcus sighed, leaning back against the couch, the cushions sinking beneath his weight. "Yeah, I figured you would." There was a pause, the kind that carried weight, before Harold pressed on. "Listen. What happened to you was beyond the pale. Unacceptable doesn't even cover it. But I know you, Marcus. You're not the type to let this slide. So tell me, what's your plan?" The question landed like a stone in Marcus's gut, heavy and unyielding. "I don't know, Harold," he admitted, running a hand over his face. "Part of me wants to put it behind me, for Alicia's sake. But another part knows that if I don't say something now, it'll keep happening to me. To others who look like me." "Then you've got your answer," Harold said, his tone firm but warm, cutting through Marcus's doubt like a blade. "You've spent your whole damn career fighting for this country. Now it's time to fight for something just as vital: justice. You're not alone in this, you hear me? If you need backup, I've got your six." Gratitude surged through Marcus, a rare flicker of light in the darkness that had settled over him. "Thank you, Harold," he said, his voice thick. "That means more than you know." When the call ended, he sat there, staring out the window at a sky cloaked in somber gray. His thoughts drifted to the countless others who'd faced the same degradation, some who'd survived it, others who hadn't. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs too. Later that day, the sharp ring of the doorbell jolted him from his reverie. He opened the door to find Sergeant Elizabeth Carter standing on his porch, her posture rigid, her face etched with unease. She clutched a manila folder in her hands, her knuckles white from the grip. "Colonel Wright," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "I wanted to come by and apologize again for yesterday." Marcus nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She hesitated, her boots scuffing the welcome mat, before crossing the threshold into the living room. Her eyes darted to the walls, where framed medals and commendations gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, a testament to a career built on grit and sacrifice. "I also brought this," she said, extending the folder toward him. Marcus took it, his fingers brushing the crisp paper as he flipped it open. Inside was a detailed report of the incident. Alongside an internal memo: Officer Travis Walker had been suspended indefinitely, pending a full investigation. "I know it's not enough," Elizabeth added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "but I'm doing everything I can to keep this from being buried." Marcus studied her for a long moment, noting the shadows under her eyes, the way her jaw clenched with quiet determination. She wasn't just a bystander, she was someone who'd seen the rot and wanted to root it out. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, his tone even but firm. "But you're right, it's not enough. This isn't about one bad apple. It's about a system that lets people like Walker think they can abuse their power without consequence." Elizabeth nodded, her expression darkening with understanding. "I agree," she said, "and I want to help, if you'll let me." Marcus considered her offer, a spark of resolve flaring within him. "All right," he replied, his voice steady with newfound purpose. "Let's start by holding them accountable. But this fight's bigger than that, it's not stopping here." Elizabeth straightened, her eyes flashing with a soldier's resolve. "I'm with you, sir," she said, and in that moment, Marcus knew the stage was set. The days that followed were a tempest of rage, hope, and unrelenting momentum. The video of Marcus's humiliation had exploded beyond anything he could have imagined, spreading like wildfire across the country. It wasn't just viral, it was a battle cry. Protests erupted, first in Charlotte, where the air thrummed with chants and the streets pulsed with restless energy, then rippling outward to New York's towering skyscrapers, Chicago's windswept corners, and the sun-soaked sprawl of Los Angeles. News channels looped the footage relentlessly, pundits clashing in fiery debates over police misconduct, racial bias, and the desperate need for change. For Marcus, the world had shifted beneath his feet, but with it came a clarity he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about reclaiming his dignity, it was about dismantling the machinery that had tried to crush it. The road ahead stretched long and treacherous, but for the first time since that fateful day, he felt the fire of purpose burning bright. The fight had only just begun. The sudden glare of attention that descended upon Marcus was a double-edged sword, slicing through the quiet life he'd once known with both promise and peril. He hadn't sought this, never once dreamed of standing as a beacon for defiance, or a figurehead for a cause. All he'd ever wanted was to live simply, to carry out his duties as a soldier and provide for his family. But fate, unyielding and unpredictable, had thrust him into a spotlight he couldn't escape. Wherever he went, eyes followed. Some sparkled with gratitude, their owners approaching him with trembling hands and soft words, thanking him for his courage, his unbreakable spirit. Others gazed at him with a pity so heavy it felt like chains, unable to see past that single, searing moment when his dignity had been stripped bare for the world to witness. Marcus felt their stares like a physical weight, a constant reminder of the man he'd become in their eyes. Not just Marcus Wright, but a symbol, a story, a wound laid open. For days, he barricaded himself within the familiar walls of his home, the hum of the outside world reduced to a distant murmur. The phone rang incessant liatists with fiery voices, reporters hungry for a soundbite, even politicians sniffing out an opportunity. Each call tightened the knot in his chest, the pressure building until it seemed his ribs might crack under the strain. He wasn't built for this, wasn't trained to navigate the chaos of public scrutiny. Yet there was Alicia, his daughter, his anchor. She watched it all unfold with eyes wide as saucers, a storm of emotion swirling within her amazement at her father's transformation, fear of what it might mean. To her, he'd always been a steady, disciplined presence, a man of few words who led by example. Now he was something else, a reluctant titan, his voice rising above the clamor, speaking truths he hadn't even known he carried. She'd sit beside him on the couch, her small frame curled into his side, and he'd feel her unspoken questions pressing against him. "What happens now? Why you?" And he had no answers, only the quiet resolve to keep going for her sake. On the third day, the phone rang again, but this time the voice on the other end carried a different weight. It was firm, deliberate, cutting through the haze of his exhaustion like a blade. "This is Senator Caroline Hunter," the woman said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "I've been following your story, Colonel Wright, and I'd like to meet with you." Marcus froze, his fingers tightening around the receiver until his knuckles ached. Senator Hunter wasn't just a name. She was a forcey, a tireless crusader against the rot in law enforcement, a woman who'd spent decades chiseling away at systemic injustices with the patience of a sculptor and the ferocity of a lion. Her interest meant his ordeal had rippled far beyond the fleeting outrage of social media. It had landed in the halls of power. "I'm listening," he managed, his voice low, guarded. They agreed to meet the next morning, and as he hung up, a flicker of unease coiled in his gut. What could she want from him, a soldier, not a savior? The meeting took place in a hushed conference room at a downtown hotel, its walls lined with dark wood that swallowed the light. Marcus arrived early, his broad shoulders squared beneath a crisp dark suit, his military posture a shield against the turmoil churning inside him. Every step echoed with the past week's 12 sleepless nights, the endless replays of that moment in the rain, but he refused to let it show. Senator Hunter awaited him, a petite figure whose presence filled the room like a storm cloud. In her late 50s, she carried herself with an authority that belied her small stature, her piercing blue eyes locking onto him as they shook hands. "Thank you for coming, Colonel," she said, her voice warm yet edged with purpose, gesturing for him to sit. "Thank you for reaching out," he replied, settling into the chair, his hands resting stiffly on his knees. "Though I'll admit, I'm not sure what I'm doing here." She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the polished table, her gaze unwavering. "Your story isn't just a video that went viral, Colonel. It's a floodlight exposing a system that's been fractured for generations. I've seen men and women broken by it, families torn apart, and I fought to change it. But you're different. People are listening to you, and that's a power we can't waste." Marcus tilted his head, his brow furrowing as skepticism crept into his expression. "I'm a soldier, Senator, not a politician or some rallying cry. I've spent my life following orders, not giving speeches." She nodded, conceding the point, but her eyes glinted with resolve. "True, but you're also a man who's lived it, a man whose voice cuts through the noise because it's real. Right now, that voice could shift the tide." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and let her words settle over him like dust. For years, he'd sidestepped these battles: race, justice, the messy tangle of right and wrong, focusing instead on the clear lines of duty and the safety of his daughter's smile. But the memory of that day clawed at him, the cold rain soaking through his uniform, the muzzle of Travis Walker's gun glinting in the downpour, the crowd's gasps as he knelt, defenseless, while the world watched. It wasn't just shame that burned in his chest now, it was fury, a quiet, smoldering thing he could no longer bury. "What do you need from me?" he asked at last, his voice steady despite the storm within. Hunter's face lit up, a spark of triumph in her eyes. "We're drafting a police reform billboard, with real teeth, mandatory bias training, independent oversight, stricter rules on force. I need someone like you, someone with a story that breathes life into the numbers, to testify before Congress, to show them what's at stake when they do nothing." The thought hit him like a punch, his stomach twisting at the image of standing before a sea of lawmakers, bearing his soul in a room dripping with judgment. Vulnerability wasn't his strength. He'd spent a lifetime building walls, not tearing them down. But then Alicia's face flashed in his mind, her voice, small but sharp, asking, "Why didn't you fight back?" And something shifted. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her, about every child who'd grow up in a world that judged them before they could speak. "When do you need me?" he said, the words heavy but certain. Meanwhile, across town, Travis Walker's life was unraveling like a threadbare tapestry, each tug pulling it further apart. The suspension had come down like a guillotine, swift, public, merciless, leaving him staggering in its wake. His name blazed across every news channel, his face plastered on screens from coast to coast, branded as the living embodiment of a broken system. At first, he clung to denial, his voice hoarse as he repeated his defense to anyone who'd listen. "I was just doing my job. I followed protocol. Rights, rank, and fame twisted this against me." He'd pace his cramped living room, the blinds drawn tight against the prying eyes of neighbors, convincing himself he was the wrong party, the scapegoat in a drama he hadn't written. But the footage, God, that footage kept playing, inescapable, looping on every TV he passed, every phone screen he glimpsed. At first, he avoided it, turning away with a curse. Yet one night, alone with a bottle of cheap whiskey, he forced himself to watch. And there it was, Marcus's eyes, wide with fear and humiliation, locked on the gun in Travis's hand. The crowd's faces, shifting from confusion to outrage as he barked commands, and worst of all, his own reflection in the shaky video arrogance etched into his sneer. anger pulsing in his clenched jaw, judgment dripping from every word. The truth sank into him like a blade. He hadn't seen a man that day. He'd seen a shadow, a stereotype, a threat conjured from his own biases. The internal investigation loomed, but he already knew the verdict. His badge was gone, his career a smoking ruin. Yet it wasn't the job's loss that kept him awake, it was the gnawing realization that Marcus had been right, and the weight of that mistake was a stone he'd carry forever. On the day of Charlotte's first protest, Marcus stood at the crowd's edge, hands buried in his pockets, the air thick with the scent of sweat and asphalt. Hundreds had gathered, their signs thrusting toward the sky like spears, their voices weaving into a chorus of fury and hope, demanding justice, demanding change. Beside him stood Alicia, clutching a sign she'd crafted herself, "Treat us with dignity," scrawled in bold marker, her handwriting shaky but fierce. Marcus's throat tightened as he watched her, her small frame dwarfed by the swelling mass of bodies. She was too young for this war, too innocent to grasp the hatred they faced, yet there she stood, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with a determination that mirrored his own. Pride flickered in his chest, fragile but real, as the crowd's energy pulsed around them. A young woman approached, her 20s marked by the fire in her step and the megaphone slung over her shoulder. "Colonel Wright?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. He nodded, and she pressed on. "We'd like you to speak. People need to hear you." The request landed like a boulder, pinning him in place. He wasn't a man of words, he was a soldier, a father, not a preacher. But as he scanned the sea of face, brown, black, white, all united in their weariness and their will, he felt the shift. His story wasn't his alone anymore. It belonged to every soul who'd been diminished, every heart judged by skin instead of spirit. He took the megaphone, its weight foreign in his hands, and stepped onto the makeshift stage. The crowd hushed, their eyes pinning him in place. "My name is Marcus Wright," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves clawing at his chest. "I've spent my life serving this country, fighting for freedoms we're all promised. But last week, I learned those promises don't always hold." The lesson was clear, woven into every tremor of his voice. Justice wasn't a gift, it was a battle. And power, when twisted, left scars that lingered long after the rain stopped falling. The air vibrated with the roar of the crowd, a tidal wave of sound crashing over Marcus as he stood at the podium, his hands gripping its edges. Their cheers pulsed through him, a raw, electric energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting it wash away the heaviness that had settled deep in his chest like a stone. He inhaled deeply, the crisp evening air filling his lungs, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet strength that belied the storm raging within him. "This isn't just my battle," he said, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. "It's ours. And it's one we can't afford to lose, not for our own sakes, but for the kids who'll come after us, for the generations who deserve better. Because no one should ever have to drop to their knees in the pouring rain, staring down the barrel of a gun, just to prove they're human." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, a chorus of voices shouting his name, "Marcus, Marcus," as if it were a war cry. He stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding against his ribs, and for the first time since that awful day, a flicker of something warm ignited inside him, purpose, hope. But beneath it, a gnawing truth lingered. War was far from won. Weeks later, Marcus Wright found himself in a different kind of arena. He sat on a hard, cushioned bench in the waiting area outside a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., the air thick with tension and the faint hum of anticipation. The hallway buzzed with life. Fides darted back and forth, their shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Journalists adjusted their cameras and murmured to one another, their notebooks clutched like shields. Politicians strode past, their faces masks of practiced composure. Marcus smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against his skin after years in military fatigues. Beside him sat Alicia, his 12-year-old daughter, her small hand resting lightly on his. Her touch was an anchor, steadying him when his nerves threatened to unravel. She tilted her head up at him, her wide brown eyes searching his face. "Are you nervous, Dad?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. a quiet strength in it that made his chest ache with pride. He managed a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. The tightness in his chest coiled tighter, a knot of anxiety he couldn't quite shake. A little, he admitted, his voice low as if confessing a secret. But this isn't about me, Alicia. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. She nodded, her expression solemn, and squeezed his hand. In her gaze, he saw a flicker of the fierce determination she'd inherited from Hema Spark that had kept him going through the chaos of the past few weeks. Those weeks had been a blur, a whirlwind of sleepless nights and relentless momentum. It had all started with that speech in Charlotte, delivered on a makeshift stage under a sky heavy with storm clouds. He'd poured his soul into those words, his voice trembling with the weight of his story, and the crowd had responded with a fire he hadn't anticipated. Overnight, his name had become a rallying cry, a symbol of a movement that demanded accountability. Justice, reform. Senator Caroline Hunter's police reform bill had ridden that wave, surging into the national spotlight with Marcus as its reluctant champion. But the role didn't sit easily on his shoulders. He wasn't a politician with polished speeches or an activist with a megaphone. He was just a man, a father, a soldier who'd spent 30 years defending a country that hadn't always defended him back. Night after night, he'd lain awake, the incident replaying in his mind like a looped reel of film, the rain soaking through his clothes, the cold metal of the gun glinting in the dim light, the officer's sneering voice barking orders. He'd questioned himself endlessly. Was he the right person for this? Did he have the strength to carry it? But Alicia's words always pulled him back. Sometimes, she'd told him one evening, her voice wise beyond her years, the people who don't chase the light are the ones who shine the brightest. A sharp voice broke his reverie. Colonel Wright, a clerk called from the doorway. Clipboard clutched to her chest, her tone brisk but not unkind. They're ready for you. Marcus rose, smoothing his jacket one last time, the cuffs catching briefly on his calloused fingers. He glanced down at Alicia, who offered him a small, fierce nod, her way of saying you've got this without words. He squared his shoulders and stepped into the hearing room, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind him with a muted thud. The room was a cavern of sound and scrutiny. Rows of reporters lined the back, their cameras clicking and flashing like a swarm of restless insects, their lenses trained on him as he crossed the polished floor. The witness table sat alone in the center, a solitary island under the harsh glare of overhead lights. Above it, on a raised dais, the members of Congress loomsome with furrowed brows and curious eyes, others with crossed arms and expressions of thinly veiled doubt. Senator Hunter sat near the middle, her posture straight but relaxed, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She caught his eye and gave him a subtle nod, a silent signal of solidarity that steadied his racing pulse. Colonel Marcus Wright, the chairman, intoned, his voice booming through the vast space, amplified by the microphone until it seemed to rattle the walls. You may begin. Marcus settled into the chair, adjusting the small microphone in front of him with deliberate care. His hands were steady, though his stomach churned with a mix of dread and resolve. He took a deep breath, the air cool against his dry throat, and began. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and honorable members of this committee, for giving me the chance to speak today, he said, his voice clear and measured, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced worse than a room full of skeptics. My name is Marcus Wright. I'm a father, a soldier, and a proud American. For over 3 decades, I've served this nation, fought for its freedoms, bled for its ideals. But a few weeks ago, I learned a hard truth. For some of us, those freedoms come with strings attached. The room fell silent, every eye locked on him, the weight of their attention pressing against his skin like a physical force. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. It was a rainy morning in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'd just left a medical clinic, unarmed, calm, following every rule. But that didn't matter to the officer who stopped me. To him, I wasn't a man with a name, a family, a life. I was a threat. He pulled his gun, forced me to my knees in the mud and the rain, and stripped me of my dignity in front of a crowd of strangers. And why? Because of the color of my skin, and the story he'd already written in his head about who I was. He paused, letting the silence stretch, the memory clawing at him with sharp, jagged edges. He could still feel the cold rain seeping into his knees, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than the chill. "I'm not here for revenge," he continued, his voice softening but no less firm. "I'm here for change. I want a world where no one black, white, or anything else is to fear the people sworn to protect them. A world where my daughter doesn't have to look at me with those big, questioning eyes and ask why I didn't fight back, because she knows that dignity and justice aren't prizes you win in a brawl via your birthright." Senator Hunter leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly, her sharp green eyes piercing through the haze of the room. "Colonel Wright," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs that had begun to ripple among the committee. "In your experience, do you see incidents like yours as rare exceptions, or do they point to something bigger, something systemic within law enforcement?" Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. "They're not exceptions, Senator," he replied, his tone hard with conviction. "They're threads in a tapestry, a pattern we've turned a blind eye to for too long. I'm not saying every officer is like the one who put me on my knees, but the system, it props up people like him. It prizes aggression over understanding, bias over fairness. And until we tear that system down and build something better, it's going to keep breaking us." The hearing stretched on for hours, a marathon of questions and answers that tested his endurance. Some senators nodded in agreement, their faces etched with empathy. Others grilled him with sharp, skeptical tones, their words dripping with doubt. He spoke of his own ordeal in painstaking detail, the way the officer's voice had snarled, the way the crowd's gasps had pierced the air. He spoke of others, tuneless faces who'd faced the same cruelty and hadn't lived to tell their stories. He spoke of reform, of the urgent need for laws that held power to account. By the time he finished, the room buzzed with a restless energy, a shift in the air that hadn't been there when he'd walked in. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's words rippled outward like stones dropped into still water. Senator Hunter's bill, no dubbed the Right Act, in his honor gained traction, crossing party lines with a speed that stunned even the most seasoned observers. It passed through Congress, mandating bias training for every officer, creating independent oversight boards in every state, and setting strict rules for when force could be used. The headlines screamed victory, but for Marcus, the real triumph was quieter. It was in the evenings he spent with Alicia on their porch, the cicadas humming in the warm night air, her small hand slipping into his as she smiled up at him. "You did it, Dad," she said one night, her voice soft but sure. He chuckled, shaking his head, the sound rough with exhaustion. "I didn't do it alone, kid. And it's not over. There's still a long road ahead." She grinned, her eyes gleaming with a stubborn faith he envied. "I know, but you started it. That's what counts." As for Travis Walker, the officer who'd held that gun to Marcus's head, his days in uniform were done. The department's investigation had been slow but thorough, peeling back layers of complaints and whispered rumors that had trailed him for years. They found him guilty of gross misconduct, his badge stripped away, his career reduced to ash with no chance of resurrection. The public had roared in outrage when the story first broke, but by the end, it was a quiet, unceremonious exit that sealed his fate. For Marcus, it wasn't about vengeance, it was about consequence. A lesson carved in stone: power abused would not go unchecked. And in that, he found a measure of peace, knowing the fight for justice wasn't just a dream, but a force that could reshape the world. Months had slipped by since that fateful incident, each one heavy with the weight of memory, when Travis, through the careful mediation of an attorney, extended an olive branch to Marcus. He asked for a private meeting, a chance to sit face to face. At first, Marcus balked at the idea, his heart a tangled mess of doubt and lingering bitterness. What could possibly come from staring into the eyes of the man who had stripped him of his dignity? In front of the world, the thought churned in his gut, a storm of reluctance brewing beneath his ribs. But then there was Alicia, his unwavering compass, her voice soft yet firm as she sat with him over a steaming cup of coffee one evening. She looked at him with those steady, knowing eyes and said, "You should go, Marcus, not for him, but for you. Closure's a gift you give yourself." Her words sank in slowly, like rain seeping into parched earth. And after days of wrestling with his pride, he agreed. The meeting took place in a small, unremarkable conference room tucked away in a drab office building. The walls were a faded beige, scuffed in places, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the plain wooden table that separated them. Marcus stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. And there was Travis Wright, once a towering figure of authority, now reduced to a frail silhouette of the man he'd been. His frame was gaunt, his uniform replaced by a simple gray sweater that hung loosely on his shoulders. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, were now sunken, rimmed with shadows, and his hands fidgeted nervously on the table's edge. The air between them was thick, charged with the echoes of that humiliating day. But Travis broke the silence first. His voice quivered, a fragile thread of sound as he began. "Marcus, I needed to see you. To tell you I'm sorry, for everything. For how I treated you. For the assumptions I jumped to without a second thought. I was wrong, terribly wrong." The words spilled out, raw and unpolished, and Marcus watched him closely, his own heart pounding as he searched Travis's face for any flicker of deceit. But all he found was a man unmoored, a soul laid bare by the brutal mirror of his own mistakes. Travis's lips trembled, his gaze dropping to the table as if he couldn't bear the weight of Marcus's scrutiny. Marcus sat still, his broad hands resting on his knees, feeling the rough fabric of his jeans beneath his palms. Inside, a tempest ragged danger clashing with something softer, something he hadn't expected: pity. He thought of the nights he'd lain awake, replaying the incident, the sting of shame burning through him as he recalled Travis's barked orders, the cold steel of handcuffs biting into his wrists, the onlooker's stares boring into his back. But now, here was that same man, broken and hollowed out, stripped of the power he'd once wielded so carelessly. After a long, heavy silence, Marcus spoke, his voice low but steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I hear your apology, Travis, and I appreciate it. But this isn't about me letting you off the hook. It's not that simple. It's about you doing the work, making damn sure no one else ever has to feel what I felt because of you." His words hung in the air, firm and unyielding, a challenge wrapped in quiet resolve. Travis lifted his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, and gave a small, shaky nod. "I will," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear I will." Time marched on, as it always does, stretching from months into years, each season bringing subtle shifts to the world beyond that small room. The incident that had once defined Marcus's life became a spark, igniting a slow but relentless wave of change. The Wright Act, so named in part for Marcus Wright, though he'd never asked for the honor, emerged as a pillar of police reform, its ripples spreading across precincts and cities nationwide. Officers were retrained, policies rewritten, and communities began to breathe a little easier. Though the work was far from done, Marcus's name, once whispered in hushed tones of sympathy or outrage, grew into a symbol of endurance, a rallying cry for those who refused to let injustice have the last word. Newspapers carried his story, activists chanted his name, and lawmakers debated his legacy in marble halls he'd never set foot in. But for Marcus, the spotlight felt distant, almost irrelevant. The real victory wasn't in the headlines or the legislation, it was in the quiet moments that stitched his life back together. He found it in the strength that had bloomed within him, a resilience forged in the fire of that awful day. It was there in the mornings when he stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the modest row houses of his neighborhood, a mug of black coffee warming his hands as he marveled at how far he'd come. It was in the pride that sparkled in his daughter's ice, little Janny, now 10 years old, with her gap-toothed grin and fierce spirit. She'd sit at the dining table, her small legs swinging as she worked on her homework, and sometimes she'd look up at him and say, "Daddy, you're my hero." Those words hit him harder than any applause ever could, lodging deep in his chest like a promise kept. And it was in the knowledge that he'd taken a moment of crushing humiliation, a memory that once made his stomach twist, and turned it into something bigger, something hopeful. Because dignity, he'd learned, wasn't a thing anyone could snatch away with a badge or a barked command. It was a flame inside him, steady and unquenchable, no matter how fiercely the storms of life raged. Travis, too, carried his own burdens forward. In the years that followed, he became a quieter man, one who spoke less of orders and more of accountability. He took to visiting community centers, his once crisp uniform traded for a worn jacket, his voice softer as he shared his story with anyone who'd listen: officers, civilians, kids barely old enough to understand. "I was blind," he'd say, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, "and it cost a good man his peace. Don't let it happen again." Some forgave him, others turned away, their anger to Rada soften. But Travis kept going, driven by a penance he'd never fully outrun. Meanwhile, Alicia remained Marcus's rock, her presence a constant hum of warmth in their home. She'd sit on their porch in the evenings, her knitting needles clicking softly as she watched the neighborhood kids play. And she'd smile at Marcus with a look that said she'd always known he'd rise above. Together, they'd built something enduring, not just a family, but a testament to the idea that justice, when fought for, could heal more than it broke. The lesson lingered, etched into every corner of their lives. Power, when abused, left scars that stretched far beyond the moment of its wielding. But just as serial justice was a force that could mend those wounds, turning pain into purpose and despair into defiance. For Marcus, it was a truth he'd carry forever, a legacy not just for himself, but for Janny, for Travis, for the countless faces he'd never meet, all bound by the hope that no storm could extinguish.